It began with a road that pointed straight toward the heart of a nation, and with a belief that the war could still be ended in a single, decisive blow. Moscow was not just a capital, it was command, industry, symbolism, and survival bound together. If it fell, many believed the Soviet Union itself would collapse behind it. By the autumn of 1941, the German advance had already torn deep into Soviet territory. Cities lay in ruins. Entire armies had been encircled. Millions were dead or captured. To those watching from Berlin, the path ahead seemed clear. Moscow was within reach, and winter, they believed, would not matter. But history was already preparing its answer. The drive toward Moscow, known as Operation Typhoon, began with violence and momentum. Armored spearheads surged forward through fields and forests, encircling Soviet forces again and again. Roads filled with prisoners. Maps were redrawn daily. The sense of inevitability returned, fragile but intoxicating. And yet, something was different now. Distances were longer than expected. Supply lines strained under constant movement. Vehicles wore down. Men collapsed from exhaustion before ever seeing the city. The closer the Germans came to Moscow, the harder the land resisted them. Autumn rains turned roads into rivers of mud. Tanks bogged down. Horses collapsed. Trucks stalled. The advance slowed not because of enemy fire alone, but because the ground itself refused to cooperate. Every mile forward cost more than the last. Inside Moscow, panic gave way to resolve. Factories were dismantled and moved east. Civilians dug trenches around the city. Militia units formed with minimal training and absolute urgency. The capital prepared to fight, not just as a city, but as an idea. Then winter arrived, not gradually, not gently, but suddenly, brutally. Temperatures plunged far below freezing. Snow blanketed everything. Weapons jammed. Fuel froze. Men wrapped themselves in anything they could find. German troops, unprepared for the cold, struggled simply to survive the night. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and lives without a shot fired. And still, the Germans pushed on. Advance units could see the outskirts of Moscow. Church domes glimmered faintly in the distance. It felt close enough to touch, and yet impossibly far. Every attempt to break through met stiffening resistance. Soviet units, battered but reinforced, dug in and fought with a determination sharpened by desperation. Then came the moment few believed possible, the counterattack. Fresh Soviet armies, transferred from the east, struck into exhausted German formations. Ski troops moved through snow the enemy could barely stand in. Artillery roared back to life. The Red Army did not merely defend, it advanced. The German front buckled. Units fell back in disorder. Positions abandoned under pressure. The illusion of final victory shattered completely. For the first time, the German army was driven back in a major campaign. Moscow held. The capital survived. And with it, the belief that the invasion could be stopped. The Battle of Moscow did not end the war, but it ended certainty. It proved that the German army could be defeated. It showed that speed and confidence could be undone by distance, weather, and resistance. It marked the moment when the war in the East became a struggle of survival, not conquest. The cost was immense. Hundreds of thousands dead or wounded, cities destroyed, families broken. But Moscow stood, and that fact echoed far beyond the battlefield. Tonight, we return to the winter road, to the mud, the snow, and the frozen breath of men who believed they were at the edge of victory, and instead found the beginning of a longer war, to Moscow, where momentum died and endurance took its place. And before we continue, if you're still here, listening quietly, if these long, unhurried journeys into history help you slow down, clear your mind, or make sense of how the world reached the shape it has today, then I hope you'll consider subscribing. When you subscribe, you're not just supporting a channel. You're helping keep this thoughtful, immersive style of storytelling alive. If this space gives you perspective, comfort, or simply somewhere steady to rest your thoughts, then stay with me. Settle in. This is the history of the Battle of Moscow, June 22nd, 1941. 3:15 in the morning. Along a frontier stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory. The darkness erupted with artillery fire, thousands of guns launching the largest invasion in human history. Wehrmacht commanders checked their watches, synchronized to Berlin time, and gave the order their men had been waiting for. Forward. Operation Barbarossa had begun. In that moment, as the first shells fell on sleeping Soviet border guards, Adolf Hitler believed he was witnessing the opening chapter of Germany's greatest triumph. He had told his generals that they would kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure would come crashing down. By dawn, it seemed he might be right. The German advance in those first days defied comprehension. Panzer divisions raced across the Soviet countryside at speeds that made the conquest of France look cautious. By the end of the first week, German forces had penetrated 200 kilometers into Soviet territory. Soviet communications collapsed. Entire armies lost contact with Moscow. Red Army units, caught completely by surprise despite numerous warnings, found themselves surrounded before they could establish defensive positions. German pilots reported roads clogged with retreating Soviet columns, trucks abandoned, artillery pieces destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. In the command posts of Army Group Center, the massive formation driving directly toward Moscow, staff officers began marking Soviet units as destroyed faster than they could update their maps. The red symbols representing enemy divisions simply vanished, replaced by the satisfying notation, annihilated. By July 9th, barely 2.5 weeks into the invasion, German forces had encircled Minsk. The Minsk pocket yielded a staggering haul. 300,000 Soviet prisoners of war, 2,500 tanks captured or destroyed, 1,500 artillery pieces. German soldiers, many of whom had fought in Poland and France, had never seen anything like it. They marched past columns of Soviet prisoners that stretched for kilometers, ragged men in brown uniforms, many without boots, stumbling eastward under guard toward uncertain fates in German prison camps. The prisoners' faces showed something the Germans recognized from France, the stunned incomprehension of total defeat. Wehrmacht photographers documented the victory, endless rows of captured tanks, forests of captured rifles, prisoners so numerous they couldn't be counted accurately. The photographs were rushed back to Berlin for propaganda newsreels. The message was clear. The Soviet Union was collapsing exactly as the Führer had predicted. The advance continued without pause. By early August, another massive encirclement closed around Smolensk. 310,000 more Soviet prisoners, another vast haul of equipment destroyed. German commanders gathered around situation maps in their headquarters and measured distances with rulers and compasses. From the starting positions on June 22nd to Moscow, roughly 1,000 kilometers. Distance already covered, 650 kilometers. Distance remaining, approximately 400 kilometers. At current rates of advance, barring major obstacles, Army Group Center would reach Moscow by late August or early September at the latest. Some optimistic staff officers suggested mid-August. Franz Halder, chief of the German Army General Staff, recorded his assessment in his diary on August 5th. It is probably no overstatement to say that the Russian campaign has been won in the space of 2 weeks. He acknowledged that fighting would continue, that the vastness of Russia meant pockets of resistance would persist, but the decisive battles, he believed, were already over. The Red Army had been destroyed. All that remained was the final pursuit to Moscow. German soldiers wrote letters home describing what they saw, what they felt, what they believed was about to happen. These letters, collected and studied by military historians decades later, reveal the confidence bordering on certainty that gripped the Wehrmacht in those summer months. A tank commander wrote to his wife that he expected to be drinking captured Soviet vodka in Moscow within 3 weeks. An infantry lieutenant told his parents that the Russians fought bravely enough, but were simply overwhelmed by German superiority in tactics, training, and equipment. A logistics officer complained about the terrible roads, but assured his brother that the difficulties wouldn't matter. The war would be over before the autumn rains came. These weren't boastful propaganda letters written for censors. These were private communications from professional soldiers assessing what they saw with their own eyes. And what they saw was an enemy in complete disarray, retreating in chaos, unable to mount coherent resistance. Yet even in those heady days of advance, troubling details emerged for those paying attention. The Red Army units that did stand and fight often fought with suicidal determination. Soviet tanks, when they appeared, sometimes proved shockingly difficult to destroy. The KV-1 heavy tank, encountered for the first time, could shrug off hits from the standard German anti-tank guns. The T-34 medium tank demonstrated sloped armor and a powerful 76mm gun that outclassed German panzers. More disturbing, the distances. Even traveling at maximum speed, mechanized columns consumed days crossing territory that looked modest on maps. The roads, dirt tracks really, dusty in summer, and presumably muddy in rain, slowed everything. German trucks, designed for European highways, broke down with alarming frequency. Horses died by the hundreds each day from exhaustion and poor forage. Supply lines stretched longer and longer, thin threads of logistics connecting the advancing spearheads to distant railheads still being converted from Soviet to German gauge. And then came the pause. On July 30th, Hitler issued Directive Number 34. The advance toward Moscow would halt temporarily. Forces would be redirected, some north toward Leningrad, others south toward Ukraine and its vital agricultural and industrial resources. The directive stunned many German commanders. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group Center, argued vehemently that Moscow lay open, that momentum must be maintained, that stopping now risked everything. Hans Guderian, the brilliant panzer commander, flew to Hitler's headquarters to plead for permission to continue eastward. Hitler refused. He had his strategic reasons. Encircle Leningrad, seize Ukraine's grain and coal, destroy the Soviet forces in the south. But the pause gave the Red Army something it desperately needed: time. Time to retreat, time to regroup, time to dig in, time for something else, something the Germans didn't yet suspect. While German formations wheeled north and south, while Hitler and his generals debated strategy, the Soviet Union was performing an act of national survival unprecedented in human history. Entire factories were being disassembled. Machine tools weighing dozens of tons were being loaded onto railway flat cars. Skilled workers and their families were boarding trains heading east, away from the front lines, toward the distant Ural Mountains and Siberia. This evacuation began in July, accelerated in August, and would continue through autumn. It was organized chaos, a race against time conducted under the threat of German bombers and advancing panzer columns. The Soviet leadership had made a calculated decision. If the Western territories would fall, then the industrial capacity to make weapons must be saved. Moscow might be threatened. Leningrad might be besieged. But as long as the factories survived somewhere beyond German reach, the Soviet Union could continue fighting. By early September, when German attention finally returned to Moscow, the situation looked different. The easy victories of June and July had exacted a price. Army Group Center had suffered approximately 213,000 casualties. Not catastrophic, but significant. Vehicle losses from wear and tear exceeded combat losses. The average German division, authorized 932 trucks, now operated with 600 or fewer. Infantry divisions, which had marched hundreds of kilometers, reported exhaustion. Soldiers who had written confidently in June about quick victory now wrote with more caution, mentioning fatigue, the vastness of the landscape, the strange determination of Soviet resistance. Still, Moscow beckoned. The prize remained visible on the horizon, both literally and figuratively. German reconnaissance flights photographed the Soviet capital, bringing back images of the Kremlin's distinctive towers, the golden domes of Orthodox churches. These photographs circulated among the troops, tangible proof of how close they were. September 6, 1941. Hitler issued Directive Number 35, Operation Typhoon. The final drive on Moscow would begin in early October. Army Group Center would be reinforced with additional divisions transferred from other sectors. Luftwaffe squadrons would concentrate on bombing Soviet positions and infrastructure around Moscow. The objective was clear and simple: encircle and capture the Soviet capital before winter. German commanders estimated they had 6 weeks, perhaps 8 at most, before autumn rains made the roads impassable. After that, they'd need to wait for the ground to freeze before resuming operations. The staff officers did their calculations again. Distance to Moscow, approximately 400 kilometers from current positions. Available time, 6 weeks. Required daily advance, 10 to 15 kilometers. Difficult, but achievable. The numbers worked. The plan was sound. The Wehrmacht, history's most successful military machine, prepared to deliver what its commanders believed would be the knockout blow. They had no idea that every assumption underlying those calculations was wrong. They had no idea what was waiting for them in the forests and fields west of Moscow. They had no idea that the war they thought they'd won was about to teach them the meaning of winter. July 4th, 1941. Moscow, the Kremlin. In a conference room still decorated with peacetime grandeur, Soviet officials gathered for a meeting that would determine their nation's survival. Joseph Stalin, recovered from the shock and paralysis that had gripped him in the first days of the invasion, authorized the creation of the Council for Evacuation. The bureaucratic name concealed a desperate purpose: move the Soviet Union's entire industrial base eastward before the Germans could capture or destroy it. The officials at that meeting knew what they were proposing was nearly impossible. They knew it had never been attempted at such scale in human history. They also knew it was the only chance the Soviet Union had of continuing the war. The council began its work immediately, identifying which factories were critical, which could be evacuated, which would have to be destroyed to prevent capture. Every decision came with an impossible deadline. The Germans were coming, and they were coming fast. The scale of what Soviet officials planned defied belief. Factories that employed thousands of workers, facilities that covered dozens of acres, installations with equipment so heavy it required special transport, all of it would be moved. Not just the machines, but the people who operated them, the engineers who maintained them, the managers who directed production. Families would be relocated. Housing would have to be found or built in the destination cities. Food supplies would need to be arranged. Transportation coordinated, all while German armies advanced closer each day. The first evacuations began in mid-July, starting with factories closest to the advancing front lines. The Kirov factory in Leningrad, producer of heavy tanks, received orders to prepare for evacuation. Workers began dismantling production lines, while German artillery shells fell on the city's outskirts. Some equipment was loaded onto barges and shipped across Lake Ladoga. Other machinery went by rail, routed through Moscow toward the Urals. What happened next would have seemed impossible if Soviet records hadn't meticulously documented it. By the end of July, entire train systems were reorganized around evacuation schedules. Soviet railways, operating on a different gauge than European rails, couldn't be easily used by advancing Germans, a defensive advantage built into the system decades earlier. Now that peculiarity served evacuation. Freight trains assembled in factory sidings, workers loaded machine tools still warm from use onto flat cars, lathes, presses, furnaces, rolling mills, electrical generators, testing equipment. Piece by piece, factories ceased to exist in their original locations. The Kharkov tractor factory, one of the Soviet Union's largest industrial complexes, began evacuation in mid-August. For weeks, trains departed every few hours carrying machinery eastward. Workers followed their factories, boarding passenger cars coupled to freight trains, watching their city disappear behind them. The destinations were cities most Soviet workers had never seen, places they had only heard about: Chelyabinsk, Sverdlovsk, Magnitogorsk, Nizhny Tagil. These Ural Mountain cities, centers of Stalin's pre-war industrialization drives, would receive the evacuated factories. The reception was chaotic. Entire factories arrived with no buildings to house them. Machinery sat on railway sidings exposed to weather, while construction crews worked frantically to erect shelter. In some cases, workers assembled production lines outdoors, operating lathes in the open air, while builders constructed walls around them. The Soviet system, for all its brutality and inefficiency, demonstrated a capacity for rapid improvisation that market economies would have struggled to match. Party officials commandeered every resource. Local industries were ordered to share space, power, materials. Housing construction accelerated despite material shortages. Workers lived in barracks, tents, even dugouts, while factories took priority for building materials. The human cost of this evacuation rarely appeared in official statistics, but it permeated every aspect of the operation. 10 to 12 million people relocated eastward between July and November 1941. Many were skilled workers whose expertise was essential, but others were simply families fleeing the German advance, refugees who happened to board evacuation trains. Children traveled separated from parents. Families arrived in Siberian cities in summer clothing, unprepared for the harsh continental climate. Food supplies, already strained by the demands of mobilization and war, stretched to the breaking point. Ration cards were introduced, then the rations reduced. People ate less so that factory workers could eat enough to maintain production. Yet the evacuation continued because everyone understood the alternative. If the Germans captured these factories, the war was over. By September, the results of this massive undertaking became visible in production statistics. Tank production, which logically should have collapsed as factories were disassembled and moved thousands of kilometers, merely dipped. Soviet factories produced 1,318 tanks in July, 1,209 in August. These weren't the outdated models of pre-war years either. Increasingly, production shifted to the T-34, the medium tank that had surprised German forces with its combination of firepower, armor, and mobility. The KV series of heavy tanks, nearly immune to most German anti-tank weapons, continued rolling off production lines. What seemed impossible was happening. The Soviet Union was simultaneously fighting a desperate defensive war in the West, while relocating its entire industrial economy eastward. Both operations proceeded in parallel, neither halting for the other. The Germans remained almost entirely ignorant of this parallel war. Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographed the abandoned factory buildings in Leningrad, Kharkov, and other captured or threatened cities. Intelligence officers noted that Soviet industrial capacity in occupied territories had been destroyed or evacuated, which was expected in a retreating army. What German intelligence failed to grasp was the destination and reconstitution of these industries. Aerial reconnaissance couldn't reach the Ural cities, where factories were being rebuilt. German agents couldn't operate effectively in the Soviet interior. Hitler and his staff looked at maps showing occupied Soviet territory that had contained approximately 60% of Soviet industrial capacity, and assumed the Soviet war economy was crippled. They made decisions based on that assumption. Those decisions would prove catastrophic. By late September, evacuated factories in the Urals began resuming production. The Kharkov tractor factory, now scattered across 3 different Ural cities, produced its first tanks in new locations just 6 weeks after evacuation began. The achievement was remarkable not for any single feat of engineering, but for the systematic organization of thousands of individual decisions. Railway schedules coordinated across thousands of kilometers. Housing construction prioritized for essential workers. Power plants operating at maximum capacity to supply evacuated factories. Food supplies maintained despite acute shortages. Every aspect of Soviet society bent toward a single purpose: keep the factories running, keep the weapons flowing to the front. The cost in human suffering was immense, deliberately obscured by Soviet wartime propaganda and post-war mythology. People froze in inadequate housing. People starved on reduced rations. People worked until exhaustion, then worked more. The statistics tell one version of the story. Between July and November 1941, Soviet railways moved 1.5 million railway freight cars carrying evacuated industry eastward. 1,523 enterprises were relocated. 2.4 million cattle were moved to prevent German capture, preserving future food supplies. These numbers represented the largest planned relocation of industrial capacity in human history, accomplished in 4 months under combat conditions. But the statistics miss the texture of experience. The worker who dismantled a Loach in Leningrad under artillery fire and reassembled it in Chelyabinsk 6 weeks later the engineer who designed production line layouts in Kharkov, rode east in a freezing freight car and drew the same layouts adapted to a new building in Sverdlovsk. The manager who closed a factory employing 3,000 workers evacuated everyone to an unknown destination and reopened the factory producing the same products in a different city before autumn ended. This parallel war, the War of Evacuation and Reconstitution, proceeded invisibly to German intelligence but visibly to everyone involved in Soviet industry and administration. Every party official, every factory director, every railway dispatcher knew what was happening and why. The Soviet Union was transforming itself from a European power centered on Moscow and Leningrad into a Eurasian power based in the Urals and Siberia. This transformation wasn't strategic choice but desperate necessity, yet it would prove decisive. In December, when Soviet forces would launch their counteroffensive west of Moscow, they would do so equipped with tanks produced in factories that had been evacuated from captured territories. The T-34s and KV-1s that would smash German positions would carry Kharkov factory serial numbers despite being built 1,000 kilometers east of Kharkov. The Germans, when they captured these tanks and examined them, would struggle to understand how Soviet production had survived. They were looking at the answer. The Soviet Union had simply moved its factories beyond German reach, then resumed production as if nothing had happened. What looked like industrial collapse from German reconnaissance photographs was actually industrial relocation. The Soviet Union hadn't lost its capacity to make weapons. It had just moved that capacity to where the Germans couldn't touch it. September 6, 1941. Adolf Hitler signed Directive Number 35, authorizing Operation Typhoon, the final assault on Moscow. German commanders received their orders with mixed feelings. The prize remained as valuable as ever. Moscow, the Soviet capital, the Soviet Union's largest city, the psychological and logistical center of Soviet resistance. Capturing Moscow would, in theory, shatter whatever remained of Soviet cohesion. But the calendar bothered the professional soldiers. September 6th was late, later than many had wanted. The Rasputitsa was coming. Every German soldier who'd studied Napoleon's campaign knew that word. Rasputitsa, the time without roads, the season when Russia's unpaved roads dissolved into impassable mud. The autumn Rasputitsa typically began in October, sometimes late September. It would last 3 to 4 weeks, then winter would freeze the ground solid again. The window of opportunity was closing, and it had always been closing. And every day spent on logistics and reorganization was a day lost to weather that respected neither Führer directives nor Wehrmacht efficiency. German logistics officers understood their situation with uncomfortable clarity. Army Group Center's supply lines now stretched over 1,000 kilometers from German railheads to frontline positions. Soviet railways used a different gauge than German and European railways, 5 feet. Exactly 152 millimeters wider than standard gauge. Every kilometer of Soviet railway captured had to be converted before German trains could use it, a time-consuming process requiring thousands of workers. Meanwhile, supplies moved by truck over roads that barely deserved the name. These weren't the paved highways of Germany or France. These were dirt tracks, dusty in summer, adequate for horse-drawn wagons and light civilian traffic, but degrading rapidly under the weight of military vehicles. A single German motorized division required 700 tons of supplies daily. An armored division required more. Multiply that by dozens of divisions, factor in the distances, and the logistics officers arrived at a disturbing conclusion. The offensive would outrun its supply lines unless Moscow fell quickly. The assumption underlying Operation Typhoon was speed. Encircle Moscow before the weather changed. Force Soviet surrender before the Rasputitsa. The offensive began October 2nd, with the largest concentration of German forces on any single sector of the Eastern Front. 3 entire armies, the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Panzer Groups, plus the 4th and 9th Armies, totaling over 1 million men, 1,700 tanks, 14,000 artillery pieces. In the opening days, the operation succeeded brilliantly. German panzer columns smashed through Soviet defensive positions. Two massive encirclements closed around Vyazma and Bryansk by October 7th, trapping over 650,000 Soviet soldiers. German commanders allowed themselves optimism. Franz Halder noted in his diary that the enemy was throwing in everything, including raw recruits, suggesting Soviet reserves were exhausted. The path to Moscow appeared open. Then, on October 7th, the rains came. Not a storm, just steady autumn rain, the kind that falls for days without drama. Within 48 hours, the roads transformed. Dirt became mud. Not the mud of European roads, but something heavier, thicker, adhesive. German vehicles sank to their axles. Trucks required towing by other trucks, which also became stuck. Panzer columns that had advanced 30 kilometers per day in dry weather now struggled to make 4 kilometers. Infantry, ordered to march forward while mechanized units dealt with mud, found themselves slogging through knee-deep muck that sucked boots off feet. Horses, the Wehrmacht's actual primary means of transport despite its mechanized reputation, died by hundreds daily from exhaustion. German quartermasters had calculated that each horse needed 11 kilograms of fodder per day. With supply columns stalled in mud, fodder didn't reach the horses. Starving horses couldn't pull wagons. The entire logistics system began to collapse. October 12th. A German panzer division, one of the elite formations that had sliced through Poland and France, covered 4 kilometers in an entire day. The division's war diary recorded the achievement without irony. 4 kilometers represented genuine progress in current conditions. Soldiers pushed vehicles by hand. Engineers corduroyed roads with logs, creating temporary firm surfaces that vehicles promptly destroyed. Tractors towed trucks that were towing other trucks in chains of mechanical dependency. Meanwhile, the calendar advanced. Every day spent wrestling with mud was a day closer to winter, to freezing temperatures that would bring their own challenges. The offensive hadn't stopped. German forces continued advancing, continued encircling Soviet units, continued pushing toward Moscow. But the pace had slowed to something barely faster than World War I infantry assaults. The Soviet defenders, struggling with the same mud, found it advantageous in one critical respect. It bought time. Time for reserves to arrive from the interior. Time for defensive positions to be prepared. Time for evacuated factories to resume production in the Urals. The Red Army was collapsing in some sectors, holding desperately in others, but it hadn't broken completely. New divisions appeared, replacing destroyed units. Some were trained troops from the Far East and Siberia. Others were militia, hastily armed Muscovites given minimal training and sent to the front. German intelligence tried to track Soviet formations, but couldn't account for the numbers. Where were these reinforcements coming from? How did the Soviet Union, after losing over 3 million men killed, wounded, or captured, still have armies in the field? By late October, German vehicle losses from mechanical failure exceeded combat losses by a factor of 3 to 1. Trucks designed for European roads broke down in Russian conditions. Tanks needed constant maintenance that couldn't be performed in field conditions. The Wehrmacht had begun Operation Barbarossa with approximately 600,000 trucks. By late October, fewer than half remained operational. The shortfall meant reliance on horses, and horses were dying faster than replacements could arrive. A German logistics officer calculated that, at current attrition rates, Army Group Center would lose its entire horse inventory before December. Without horses to move supplies from railheads to combat units, the offensive would halt regardless of tactical success. This calculation, buried in administrative reports, never reached Hitler. The Führer received optimistic assessments from field commanders who believed one more push would break Soviet resistance. November brought a shift in German strategic thinking, subtle but significant. Orders from Army High Command began emphasizing consolidation of gains, securing defensive positions for winter, ensuring supply lines. These were prudent military instructions, the kind professional soldiers issue when they recognize that offensive operations are outrunning their logistics. But they contradicted Hitler's fundamental strategic vision. Hitler had ordered Moscow's capture. Consolidating short of Moscow meant accepting that the city wouldn't fall in 1941. It meant acknowledging that Operation Barbarossa, the campaign to destroy the Soviet Union in a single summer offensive, had failed. Hitler rejected such assessments. He ordered the offensive to continue, demanded renewed efforts, insisted that German will would overcome Russian mud and Soviet resistance. The disconnect between Hitler's orders and battlefield reality created a crisis of command. Field commanders knew their units were exhausted. They knew their logistics were barely functional. They knew winter was approaching with no proper winter equipment in the supply pipeline. Yet they received orders to attack, to push forward, to reach Moscow before snow fell. On October 20th, Hans Guderian, commanding the 2nd Panzer Army, wrote in his diary, "The roads have become so bad that we cannot move supplies forward." He had approximately 150 kilometers to cover to reach his objectives. In good conditions, a week's travel. In current conditions, perhaps 3 weeks if everything went perfectly. Nothing was going perfectly. His tanks were running out of fuel, his men were running out of food, his horses were running out of fodder, and somewhere ahead, beyond the mud and rain, Moscow waited with whatever defenses the Soviets had managed to prepare. The fundamental miscalculation underlying Operation Typhoon was temporal. German planning assumed Moscow would fall before the Rasputitsa, or shortly after the ground froze. This assumption contained multiple errors. First, it underestimated how long the mud season would last. Second, it assumed that frozen ground would restore mobility, ignoring the fact that German vehicles and German soldiers lacked winterization. Third, it presumed that Soviet resistance would collapse once encircled, when in fact surrounded Soviet units often fought to the death, tying down German forces. Fourth, and most critically, it failed to account for the Soviet Union's strategic depth and mobilization capacity. Germany was fighting a country that could trade space for time, that could replace destroyed armies with new armies, that could relocate its factories beyond German reach and continue production. The Wehrmacht had defeated the Red Army units that existed in June 1941, but the Red Army of November 1941 was a different entity, reconstituted from reserves the Germans hadn't known existed. The Germans were gambling on speed, betting they could reach Moscow before weather and logistics defeated them. The Soviets were gambling on time, betting they could hold long enough for winter to arrive. Both sides understood that November would determine which gamble succeeded. September 14th, 1941. Tokyo. Richard Sorge, a German journalist respected in diplomatic circles, composed a message to his actual employers in Moscow. Sorge was many things: a charming socialite, a trusted confidant of the German ambassador to Japan, a skilled observer of Asian politics. He was also the Soviet Union's most valuable intelligence agent. The message he sent that September day contained information that would reshape the war. Japan had decided to strike south towards Southeast Asia and the Pacific, not north into Soviet Siberia. Japanese military planners had concluded that the resources they needed, oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, lay south. The northern option, attacking the Soviet Union while Germany attacked from the west, had been considered and rejected. Sorge's message, when it reached Moscow, represented the single most important piece of strategic intelligence the Soviet Union would receive during the entire war. Joseph Stalin, paranoid by nature and profession, distrusted intelligence reports. He had ignored dozens of warnings about the German invasion in June. But Sorge's intelligence about Japan aligned with other indicators Soviet intelligence had gathered. Japanese troop movements pointed south. Diplomatic communications suggested Japan's focus was on Southeast Asian targets. Most importantly, Japan hadn't attacked when Germany invaded, despite that being the optimal strategic moment. If Japan had intended to attack Siberia, June 1941 would have been the time. By September, with the Soviet Far East still unmolested, Stalin began to believe that the Eastern threat was manageable. This belief freed him to make a decision of tremendous risk: transfer divisions from the Far East to defend Moscow. If Sorge's intelligence was wrong, if Japan attacked after Soviet forces departed, the consequences would be catastrophic. But if Sorge was right, these transfers could save Moscow. The trains began moving in late September, from Vladivostok, from Khabarovsk, from bases scattered across the Soviet Far East. Entire divisions boarded westbound trains. These weren't the hastily mobilized militia units defending Moscow's approaches. These were professional soldiers, some with combat experience from border clashes with Japanese forces in 1939. The 16th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Konstantin Rokossovsky, departed from the Trans-Baikal region. The 5th Army followed. Individual rifle divisions pulled out of defensive positions they'd occupied for months, positions built to resist Japanese invasion. The railway journey from Vladivostok to Moscow covered over 9,000 kilometers, requiring a week or more, depending on routing and priority. Entire armies disappeared from the Far East, traveling in secrecy across Siberia, their destinations unknown even to many of the soldiers. German intelligence completely failed to detect this massive troop movement. Luftwaffe reconnaissance couldn't reach the Trans-Siberian Railway. German agents couldn't operate effectively in the Soviet interior. Wehrmacht intelligence officers compiled estimates of Soviet strength around Moscow based on visible units and reasonable assumptions about Soviet mobilization capacity. Their estimates were wrong by hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The ghost armies were moving, invisible to German eyes, traveling toward a battlefield where the Wehrmacht believed Soviet reserves were exhausted. The strategic surprise being prepared dwarfed anything the Germans had achieved with their encirclement operations. The Soviets weren't just defending anymore, they were preparing to counterattack. October 1st, 1941. General Georgy Zhukov arrived in Moscow. Stalin had summoned him from Leningrad, where Zhukov had organized that city's desperate defense. Zhukov's reputation preceded him, ruthless, competent, willing to accept massive casualties to achieve objectives. Stalin needed those qualities now. The Western Front defending Moscow was collapsing. The Vyazma and Bryansk encirclements had destroyed multiple Soviet armies. German forces were advancing faster than Soviet reserves could deploy. Stalin asked Zhukov if Moscow could be held. Zhukov toured the front lines, assessed the situation, and gave his answer. Moscow could be held, but only if reinforcements arrived immediately and if the defense was coordinated properly. Stalin gave Zhukov command of the Western Front with instructions to hold at any cost. The phrase "at any cost" was not rhetorical. Both men understood it meant exactly what it said. Zhukov immediately began reorganizing Moscow's defenses. He identified critical sectors, reallocated artillery, established headquarters with reliable communications. But his most important task was coordinating the arrival and deployment of the Siberian divisions. These units were arriving piecemeal, scattered across multiple railway stations, needing immediate integration into defensive positions. The 32nd Rifle Division from Siberia arrived, derained near Moscow, and marched directly to the front lines. Many soldiers saw Moscow for the first time as they passed through on their way to defensive positions west of the city. This was what they'd traveled across Siberia to defend. A city most had never seen, representing an idea more than a place, the capital, the political center, the symbolic heart of the Soviet Union. The quality difference between Siberian divisions and the militia defending Moscow was immediately apparent. These were trained soldiers with months or years of service. They had proper equipment, winter clothing, weapons that worked. Many had combat experience, if only from border skirmishes. They knew how to dig proper defensive positions, how to coordinate infantry and artillery, how to conduct night operations. German forces encountering these troops in late October reported fighting significantly harder than previous encounters. Wehrmacht intelligence officers updated their estimates of Soviet strength, not realizing they were observing an entirely new force composition. The Soviets weren't scraping the bottom of the manpower barrel. They were deploying fresh armies that had been held in reserve for a different war. By mid-October, approximately 15 divisions, roughly 250,000 men, had transferred from the Far East to the Moscow region. More were en route. These forces didn't appear on any German intelligence assessment because German intelligence had no mechanism to detect them. The transfers relied on the Trans-Siberian Railway, a rail line entirely within Soviet territory beyond German reconnaissance. Soviet operational security, their Maskirovka, functioned perfectly. Radio silence was maintained. Troop movements were conducted at night when possible. Units were given false designations. German intelligence, relying on intercepted communications and tactical reconnaissance, built a picture of Soviet strength that missed entire armies. The ghost armies had arrived, and the Germans didn't know they existed. On October 18th, Soviet ski troops deployed for the first time in forest fighting west of Moscow. These specialized units, drawn primarily from Siberian and northern divisions, could operate in terrain and weather that immobilized conventional forces. They attacked German positions in early snow, appearing from forests in white camouflage, engaging in brief firefights, then disappearing before German forces could respond effectively. German troops found this warfare unsettling. They'd defeated Soviet forces in massive encirclements, captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners, advanced hundreds of kilometers. Now they faced an enemy that wouldn't stay encircled, that appeared from nowhere, that seemed adapted to conditions that paralyzed the Wehrmacht. The psychological impact exceeded the tactical damage. German soldiers began to doubt whether Moscow would fall before winter. The strategic gamble Stalin had made, trusting Sorge's intelligence, weakening the Far East, transferring forces westward, was succeeding beyond reasonable expectation. Japan remained focused on southward expansion. Soviet Far East forces arrived in time to reinforce Moscow's defenses. The Wehrmacht, already struggling with mud and logistics, now faced an enemy that was stronger than German intelligence believed possible. But the gamble's success depended on secrecy. If the Germans learned that major Soviet reserves had deployed around Moscow, they might adjust their strategy, perhaps delaying the offensive until spring 1942. Zhukov needed the Germans to attack soon, to attack against what they believed were weak Soviet defenses, to commit to an offensive that would extend German forces to the breaking point. Then, and only then, would the ghost armies reveal themselves. The Siberian divisions waited in their defensive positions, veterans of garrison duty now assigned to defend a city most had never seen against an enemy they'd only heard about. They'd traveled across an entire continent for this moment. Their journey represented the largest strategic redeployment of military forces in history to that point, accomplished in secrecy, coordinated across thousands of kilometers, executed while the Soviet Union fought for survival. The Germans advancing toward Moscow believed they faced the scattered remnants of defeated Soviet armies. They had no idea that beyond the hastily constructed defensive positions, beyond the militia units fighting desperately to slow the German advance, entire armies waited with winter equipment and fighting determination. The ghost armies were no longer ghosts. They were soldiers with rifles, waiting for orders to attack. Those orders would come soon. November 7th, 1941. The temperature dropped overnight to minus 12 degrees Celsius, 10 degrees Fahrenheit. German soldiers woke to frozen equipment, frost-covered tents, and a realization that transformed confusion into fear. They had no winter uniforms. The cold arrived suddenly, not the gradual temperature decline of a European autumn, but the sharp transition of a continental climate. Soldiers who'd been complaining about mud now faced a different enemy. Water froze in canteens. Bread became solid as wood. Vehicle engines wouldn't start. Machine guns wouldn't fire. Everything metal became painful to touch with bare skin. The cold penetrated every aspect of existence, relentless and indiscriminate. German officers checked supply manifests, searching for the winter equipment that was supposed to arrive. Those uniforms existed. They sat in warehouses in Poland, awaiting transport. The same logistics crisis that had bogged down the offensive in mud now prevented winter equipment from reaching the soldiers who desperately needed it. By November 13th, German field hospitals began receiving casualties that had nothing to do with Soviet fire. Frostbite, hundreds of cases daily, then thousands. Soldiers wrapped themselves in whatever they could find. Soviet coats stripped from prisoners, civilian clothing looted from abandoned villages, blankets fashioned into capes. The improvised winter gear helped but couldn't substitute for proper equipment. Soviet soldiers wore quilted telegreka jackets designed for temperatures well below zero. They had valenki, thick felt boots that insulated feet from frozen ground. German soldiers had the same uniforms they'd worn advancing through summer heat, augmented by standard wool coats adequate for German winters, but insufficient for Russian cold. The temperature differential wasn't extreme by Russian standards, minus 12, minus 15, but it was enough to incapacitate soldiers unprepared for it. November 15th marked the first reported case of a phenomenon that would become grimly common. A German machine gun crew discovered their MG-34 wouldn't fire. They'd maintained the weapon according to regulations, kept it clean, loaded it properly. It simply wouldn't function. The problem was lubricant. German weapons used oil-based lubricants that performed excellently in European temperatures. At minus 15 degrees Celsius, the oil thickened to near-solid consistency. Metal parts that should slide smoothly now moved sluggishly or not at all. Firing pins struck too slowly to reliably detonate primers. Recoil mechanisms froze. German armorers experimented with different lubricants, tried cleaning weapons to remove all oil, even attempted dry firing without lubricant. Nothing worked reliably. Soviet weapons, lubricated with graphite-based compounds designed for winter use, continued functioning. The technological advantage the Wehrmacht had relied on throughout the campaign was evaporating. Vehicle maintenance became a nightmare of improvisation. Tank engines needed to be started periodically to prevent complete freezing, but fuel shortages meant engines couldn't run continuously. Crews tried lighting fires beneath their tanks to warm engines enough to start, a technique that worked occasionally and destroyed tanks through fire damage frequently. Trucks sat immobilized with frozen coolant, cracked engine blocks, seized transmissions. The standard procedure for starting a cold engine, using preheaters, warming oil, gradual mechanical preparation, was impossible in field conditions without proper equipment or adequate fuel. Drivers resorted to desperate measures. Some drained engine oil at night, took it inside heated shelters, and reinstalled warm oil in the morning. This worked if you had heated shelter and extra oil. Most crews had neither. By late November, the casualty statistics told a story that military headquarters struggled to accept. Cold weather injuries exceeded combat casualties. Army Group Center reported 100,000 cold weather casualties by early December, a number that represented roughly 1 in 10 soldiers in the entire formation. These weren't deaths mostly, but injuries severe enough to require evacuation. Frostbite so severe that amputation was necessary. Hypothermia requiring extended hospitalization. Frozen lungs from breathing extremely cold air during exertion. Field hospitals, already overwhelmed with combat wounded, now dealt with casualties from an enemy that couldn't be shot, outmaneuvered, or defeated through tactical brilliance. The German medical system, designed for a short war with predictable casualty rates, was collapsing under the sheer volume of injured soldiers. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on the soldiers experiencing it. They'd prayed for the mud to freeze. They'd complained that Rasputitsa was preventing the offensive from reaching Moscow. Now the ground had frozen, the roads were passable again, and it didn't matter because their vehicles wouldn't run and they were too cold to fight effectively. A German soldier's letter home, intercepted by Soviet intelligence and later found in archives, captured the mood. "We are not fighting an enemy, we are fighting nature itself. Give me Russians to shoot at rather than this terrible cold." The letter was dated November 28th. The temperature that day reached minus 20 degrees Celsius. Colder weather was coming. Soviet forces, meanwhile, operated in the same conditions but with crucial advantages. They had winter uniforms, they had winterized weapons, they had vehicles maintained with cold weather lubricants. More importantly, they had experience. Many Soviet soldiers came from Siberia, from the Urals, from regions where winter meant minus 30 or minus 40 as a matter of routine. They knew how to move in deep snow, how to construct shelters, how to recognize frostbite symptoms before permanent damage occurred. The Red Army issued felt boots and quilted jackets not as exotic equipment but as standard winter gear. Soviet logistics, battered as they were by months of retreat and German advances, still managed to deliver winter equipment to frontline troops. German logistics, stretched across 1,000-kilometer supply lines, couldn't deliver winter uniforms sitting in Polish warehouses. The temperature dropped further. November 22nd, minus 25 degrees Celsius. December 1st, minus 30 degrees Celsius. December 4th, minus 35 degrees Celsius. Each degree colder multiplied the Wehrmacht's problems exponentially. Weapons that functioned at -15 became useless at -30. Vehicles that started reluctantly at -20 wouldn't start at all at -35. Human bodies, stressed by months of combat and inadequate nutrition, succumbed to cold faster than healthy bodies would have. German soldiers burned furniture from abandoned houses, used precious fuel to heat shelters, huddled together for warmth. Nothing helped enough. The Eastern Front was consuming the Wehrmacht not through Soviet tactical brilliance, but through environmental conditions German planning had dismissed as manageable. German logistics officers compiled reports trying to explain the crisis to higher headquarters. Winter uniforms existed in sufficient quantity, they noted, but transportation capacity didn't exist to move them forward. The railway network from Germany to the front lines could handle either ammunition and fuel or winter equipment, not both. Combat operations consumed ammunition at rates that required constant resupply. Fuel shortages were already critical. Choosing to transport winter uniforms would mean reducing ammunition deliveries, which would cripple offensive operations. Choosing to maintain ammunition deliveries meant soldiers would continue fighting and dying from cold. The officers presented these choices neutrally, as logistics professionals should, but the implications were clear. Operation Barbarossa's planning had failed to account for a winter campaign. The entire logistics system was designed for summer war ending in Soviet collapse. That collapse hadn't occurred. Now, the Wehrmacht faced consequences of assumptions that had proven catastrophically wrong. By early December, approximately 40% of German vehicles on the Eastern Front were non-operational. The frozen roads that were supposed to restore mobility instead highlighted how unprepared German equipment was for winter warfare. Stalin's Soviet Union, for all its failures and all the disasters of June through October, had prepared for winter because winter was Russia's seasonal reality. Hitler's Germany had prepared for quick victory because quick victory was Hitler's strategic vision. Now, in the forests and fields west of Moscow, vision collided with reality. The temperature continued falling. The calendar advanced toward winter solstice, the darkest days of the year. German soldiers, veterans of Poland and France, conquerors of Yugoslavia and Greece, men who'd advanced 650 kilometers into Soviet territory in 5 months, now struggled to advance 650 meters in a day. The frost that had finally frozen the mud had also frozen the Wehrmacht's ability to fight. Moscow waited, just kilometers away but impossibly distant. And in Soviet defensive positions, Siberian divisions checked their weapons, adjusted their winter gear, and waited for orders that would transform this defensive struggle into something else entirely. November 27, 1941. Reconnaissance elements of the 2nd Panzer Division reached Krasnaya Poliana, a village whose name would acquire symbolic significance in German military history. The village sat just 22 kilometers from the Kremlin. German officers, using field glasses in the clear winter air, reported they could see Moscow's distinctive spires on the horizon. Whether they actually saw the city or convinced themselves they saw it hardly mattered. What mattered was the proximity. 22 kilometers. In summer, advancing across France, a panzer division covered that distance in a single day's operation. Now, in December 1941, 22 kilometers represented an impossible distance. The 2nd Panzer Division had reached the high water mark of German expansion eastward. They didn't know it yet, but they would never get closer to Moscow. This was the farthest point. The last mile multiplied by 22, and every one of those kilometers would prove uncrossable. December 1st brought the absolute nearest approach to Moscow by any Wehrmacht unit. The 258th Infantry Division reached the Khimki Bridge on Moscow's northern outskirts. German soldiers could see Moscow's city limits. They could see buildings, roads, defensive positions, all the tangible evidence that the Soviet capital was right there, close enough to touch. 8 kilometers from Moscow's administrative boundary, 23 kilometers from Red Square. The soldiers who reached this point photographed their achievement. These photographs, later published in Signal magazine and other German propaganda outlets, showed Wehrmacht troops with Moscow in the background, proof that German forces had come within sight of the enemy capital. The photographs circulated widely, used to maintain public morale in Germany. What the photographs didn't show was the reality. These troops were exhausted, freezing, undersupplied, and incapable of advancing further. That same day, December 1st, German commanders held a meeting that exposed the Wehrmacht's true condition. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commanding the Fourth Army, met with his staff officers to assess the situation. The reports were uniformly grim. Divisions were reporting 30 to 50% strength. Some regiments that should number 3,000 men had been reduced to 300 or 500 effectives. The rest were dead, wounded, evacuated with frostbite, or simply missing, lost to the vast distances and chaotic combat. Tank strength had collapsed. The 7th Panzer Division, which began Operation Barbarossa with 265 tanks, now reported 38 operational vehicles. The others were destroyed, broken down, or abandoned due to lack of fuel or spare parts. Artillery ammunition was rationed. Infantry squads were combined due to personnel losses. The offensive was continuing through momentum and desperation, not through actual combat capability. December 2nd. German commanders began discussing possibilities no one wanted to voice explicitly. What if Moscow doesn't fall? What if Soviet resistance doesn't collapse? What if we can't maintain our positions through winter? These questions contradicted every assumption underlying Operation Barbarossa. The campaign plan assumed Soviet defeat before winter. Hitler's directives demanded Moscow's capture. Suggesting that the objective was unachievable bordered on defeatism, potentially career-ending or worse. Yet, professional officers couldn't ignore the evidence. Their divisions were wrecks of their former selves. Their supply lines were barely functional. Their soldiers were fighting and dying from cold, as much as from Soviet fire. And the Soviets, who should have been defeated months ago, kept fighting. December 4th marked the final German reconnaissance probe toward Moscow. A small force pushed forward, probing for weaknesses in Soviet defenses, searching for any gap that might allow a deeper penetration. They encountered immediate, heavy defensive fire. Soviet positions were manned, prepared, and determined. The reconnaissance force pulled back after suffering casualties it couldn't afford. German commanders reviewed the reports and reached an unspoken consensus. The offensive had culminated. They'd reached the limit of their advance. Every military professional understood the concept of culmination, the point where an attacking force exhausts its offensive power and must either retreat or transition to defense. Army Group Center had reached that point. The question now was whether commanders would acknowledge it and whether Hitler would accept it. The temperature on December 5th reached minus 35 degrees Celsius, negative 31 Fahrenheit. In those conditions, metal became so cold it burned exposed skin on contact. Breath froze in beards and mustaches. Leather equipment became brittle and cracked. Human bodies, even healthy bodies with adequate nutrition and proper clothing, struggled to maintain core temperature. German soldiers, undernourished after months of inadequate rations and dressed in improvised winter gear, suffered terribly. Field hospitals reported soldiers simply lying down in snow and giving up, hypothermia overtaking them before they could be evacuated. Others developed frostbite so severe that amputation became necessary to prevent gangrene. The Wehrmacht was disintegrating not through military defeat, but through environmental exposure. German staff officers began using a word they had avoided for months: retreat. Not as a proposal, not yet, but as a possibility requiring planning. If Moscow couldn't be taken before winter became completely impassable, then forces would need to withdraw to defensible positions with better supply routes. This wasn't defeat, the officers argued, merely prudent military necessity. Winter quarters could be established, supplies accumulated, and offensive operations resumed in spring. The logic was sound, the kind of tactical adjustment that professional armies make routinely, but it ignored Hitler's strategic vision. Hitler didn't want tactical adjustments. He wanted Moscow. He wanted victory. He wanted vindication of his decision to invade the Soviet Union. Retreat would represent acknowledgement that Barbarossa had failed. At the furthest point of German advance, soldiers who could see Moscow with field glasses understood something their commanders were reluctant to admit. They would never enter that city. The distance was too short to matter militarily and too great to cross. Soviet defenses were too strong. German forces were too weak. Winter was too cold. The combination of factors that had allowed the Wehrmacht to conquer Poland, France, Yugoslavia, and Greece in lightning campaigns simply didn't apply here. The Soviet Union was too vast, too deep, too willing to trade space for time. The Red Army was too numerous, too capable of regeneration, too determined. The Russian winter was too cold, too hostile, too indifferent to German technological superiority. 22 kilometers from the Kremlin, German soldiers looked at the prize they couldn't reach and understood, perhaps for the first time, that they'd lost. The photographs taken at Krasnaya Poliana and Khimki Bridge would become symbols of different narratives. For German propaganda, they represented how close the Wehrmacht had come to victory, how nearly Hitler's strategy had succeeded. Look, the photographs said, "We almost made it." For Soviet propaganda, the photographs represented the furthest extent of fascist aggression, the high water mark that would never be exceeded. Look, the photographs said, this was as far as they got. For historians examining the battle decades later, the photographs represent something else. The moment when German planning collided with reality. The moment when assumptions about Soviet weakness met the truth of Soviet resilience. The moment when Hitler's vision of quick victory encountered the reality of extended war. December 5th, late evening, German commanders received reports of unusual Soviet activity on multiple sectors of the front. Increased radio traffic, movement behind Soviet lines, artillery being moved into forward positions. The reports were fragmentary, incomplete, concerning, but not yet alarming. German intelligence officers tried to assess whether these indicators represented local Soviet counterattacks or something larger. They couldn't know that Soviet forces were preparing the largest coordinated offensive of the war to date. They couldn't know that the ghost armies had arrived and were preparing to strike. They couldn't know that their defensive positions, hastily prepared and manned by exhausted troops, were about to face attacks by fresh Siberian divisions equipped for winter warfare. All they knew was that something was happening on the other side of the line. By tomorrow, they would know what. November 29th, 1941. The Kremlin, Moscow. General Georgy Zhukov stood before Joseph Stalin's desk, presenting a plan that would either save Moscow or destroy the Soviet Union's last military reserves. The two men had met many times over the preceding weeks. Urgent conferences where Zhukov reported on defensive operations and Stalin demanded results. This meeting was different. Zhukov wasn't reporting on defense anymore. He was proposing offense. The Germans, he explained, had extended themselves to the breaking point. Their forces were exhausted, undersupplied, immobilized by cold and mechanical failures. Soviet intelligence reported German divisions at 30 to 50% strength. Most critically, the Germans believed Soviet reserves were exhausted. They were wrong. 3 full armies, the 10th, 20th, and 1st Shock, plus significant elements of 5 more armies were assembled around Moscow, many freshly arrived from the Far East. These forces totaled approximately 720,000 troops, 5,900 guns and mortars, 415 tanks. The Germans didn't know these armies existed. Stalin listened to Zhukov's presentation with his characteristic inscrutability. The Soviet leader trusted few people, and Zhukov had earned that trust through competence demonstrated at Leningrad. But the proposal was risky beyond normal military calculation. If the counteroffensive failed, if the Germans defeated these reserve armies, Moscow would fall within days. No additional reserves existed to stop German forces. The Soviet Union's Far East would be stripped of troops, vulnerable to Japanese attack if Sorge's intelligence proved wrong. The evacuated factories were producing weapons again, but not yet at sufficient rates to replace catastrophic losses. Everything depended on this counteroffensive succeeding. Stalin asked the question that defined his leadership style. "Are you certain?" Zhukov gave the answer that defined his. "I am certain we must try. I cannot be certain of success." Over the next week, Soviet commanders conducted final preparations with extraordinary secrecy. Maskirovka, military deception, was a Soviet operational art, refined through years of practice and necessity. Radio silence was enforced absolutely. Units being moved into attack positions traveled at night. Camouflage discipline was maintained rigidly. Artillery batteries were deployed under cover of darkness, their positions concealed during daylight. Even soldiers participating in the offensive didn't know the full scope of operations planned. This operational security was essential because the entire plan depended on surprising the Germans. If Wehrmacht intelligence detected the buildup, German commanders would adjust their deployments, establish defensive positions, perhaps even preempt the Soviet attack with their own operations. December 1st brought final confirmation that the offensive would proceed. Stalin authorized Zhukov's plan with minimal modifications. The counteroffensive would begin December 5th or 6th, depending on final preparations and weather conditions. The objectives were ambitious: strike simultaneously north and south of Moscow, collapse the German salients threatening the city, destroy as much German combat power as possible, push the Wehrmacht back from Moscow's immediate vicinity. Success would save Moscow. Failure would doom the Soviet capital and possibly the entire Soviet Union. The stakes couldn't be higher. Stalin, having made his decision, conveyed his expectations to Zhukov with brutal clarity: succeed or accept the consequences of failure. Both men understood what consequences meant. December 4th. Officers commanding the newly arrived Siberian divisions received their final briefings. Many of these officers had combat experience from border clashes with Japanese forces in Manchuria. They understood mechanized warfare, combined arms operations, how to coordinate infantry advances with artillery support. They'd never fought the Wehrmacht, but they'd studied German tactics through intelligence reports and captured documents. Their soldiers, drawn from Siberia and the Far East, were professional troops with winter warfare experience. Unlike the militia that had defended Moscow through October and November, these divisions could conduct offensive operations in winter conditions. They had proper equipment, adequate ammunition, functioning weapons. They were rested, having spent weeks in transit rather than constant combat. They represented the Soviet Union's last operational reserve, the final card Stalin could play. December 5th, 3 in the morning, Soviet artillery batteries moved into their final attack positions. The darkness and falling snow provided cover. German defensive positions, manned by exhausted soldiers trying to survive another freezing night, detected nothing. Soviet commanders synchronized watches, reviewed artillery fire plans one final time, confirmed communications with their subordinate units. Everything was ready. The offensive would begin in hours. 720,000 Soviet soldiers, many fresh from Siberia, prepared to attack German forces that had no idea what was about to hit them. The quantitative advantage the Soviets possessed, more troops, more artillery, more tanks than Germans anticipated, would matter only if translated into tactical success. Numbers meant nothing if attacks were poorly coordinated, if artillery support failed, if units became disorganized. Soviet military performance over the preceding months had been mixed at best, catastrophic at worst. This offensive would test whether the Red Army had learned from its defeats. The calculated risk Stalin had accepted went beyond immediate military concerns. If the offensive failed and Moscow fell, the political consequences within the Soviet system would be severe. Stalin's authority rested partly on his leadership mystique, carefully cultivated through propaganda and ruthlessly enforced through the security apparatus. A catastrophic military failure might embolden potential rivals, might fracture the Communist Party's unity, might even trigger the collapse that Hitler anticipated. Stalin had executed generals for failures less significant than losing Moscow. Now he was gambling everything on Zhukov's judgment that the Wehrmacht was vulnerable. The irony wasn't lost on either man. The dictator who'd purged the Red Army's leadership in the late 1930s now depended on one of the few competent generals who'd survived those purges. December 5th, 11 in the evening. Stalin telephoned Zhukov at his headquarters. The conversation was brief, recorded in Zhukov's memoirs years later. "Are you certain?" Stalin asked again. "We attack at dawn," Zhukov replied. Stalin hung up without further comment. Both men knew that certainty was impossible in war. The best military plans survived only until contact with the enemy. German forces might fight harder than expected. Weather might interfere with Soviet operations. Coordination might fail. Any of 1,000 variables could derail the offensive. But the strategic logic was sound. hit the Germans when they were weakest. Exploit their exhaustion and environmental vulnerability. Use surprise to overcome any remaining German tactical advantages. It was the kind of calculated risk that could win wars or lose them. Across the front lines, in villages and forests west of Moscow, Soviet soldiers performed final preparations. They checked their rifles, ensured their winter gear was properly fastened, ate whatever rations were available, and waited for orders. Many were teenagers, drafted months earlier and given minimal training. Others were veterans of the Finnish War or the border conflicts with Japan. Some were political officers, Communist Party members whose role was to maintain morale and enforce discipline. They represented the vast diversity of the Soviet Union: Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Siberians, Central Asians, Caucasians, united by the immediate goal of defending their capital and the broader goal of surviving German invasion. They didn't know the full scope of the offensive planned. They knew only that tomorrow they would attack. The temperature on December 5th reached -35°C. In those conditions, attacking was nearly as difficult as defending. But Soviet forces had advantages the Germans lacked: winter clothing, winterized equipment, experience operating in extreme cold. More importantly, they had something the Germans had lost: confidence. The Wehrmacht had advanced hundreds of kilometers, had won every major battle, had encircled and destroyed multiple Soviet armies. Yet here they were, frozen and exhausted outside Moscow, unable to advance further. The Red Army had been defeated repeatedly, had lost millions of men, had abandoned vast territories. Yet here they were, still fighting, about to launch a major offensive. The psychological balance was shifting. Germans who'd believed in inevitable victory now doubted whether Moscow would fall. Soviets who'd expected defeat now believed survival was possible. That shift in belief, impossible to quantify on any military balance sheet, mattered as much as divisions and tanks. December 6th, dawn. The offensive would begin within hours. The ghost armies were about to reveal themselves. The gamble was about to pay off or fail catastrophically. There was no middle ground. Either the Wehrmacht would be driven back from Moscow, or the Soviet Union's last reserves would be destroyed, and the capital would fall. Stalin had wagered everything on Zhukov's judgment, on Sorga's intelligence, on the Red Army's capacity to conduct offensive operations despite months of defeats. Zhukov had wagered his reputation, and probably his life, on the plan he'd convinced Stalin to approve. The Soviet soldiers waiting in freezing darkness had wagered their lives on orders from commanders they'd never met, defending a city many had never seen. In a few hours, they would know if those wagers were wise or foolish. The artillery was ready. The orders were clear. All that remained was to begin. December 6th, 1941, 5:30 in the morning. The darkness north of Moscow erupted with sound. Soviet Katyusha, multiple rocket launchers, opened fire, their distinctive shrieking roar announcing the beginning of the counteroffensive. German soldiers huddled in defensive positions heard the sound first, a rising scream like nothing they'd encountered before, then saw the rockets' fiery trails arcing through the pre-dawn sky. The Katyushas fired in rapid succession, each launcher releasing 16 rockets in 20 seconds. Dozens of launchers fired simultaneously, creating a storm of high explosives that saturated German positions. The rockets weren't particularly accurate, but accuracy didn't matter when targeting area positions. The psychological effect exceeded the physical damage. German soldiers, exhausted from months of combat and weeks of freezing, faced an enemy they'd thought was defeated, launching an attack of shocking intensity. December the 7th. The 1st Guards Cavalry Corps attacked near Yakroma, exploiting a snowstorm that reduced visibility to near zero. Soviet cavalry tactics, dismissed by military theorists as obsolete, proved devastatingly effective in these conditions. Horsemen could move through snow that immobilized vehicles. They could navigate forests and ravines impassable to tanks. The cavalry struck during the storm's peak, appearing from the swirling snow, firing at close range, then disappearing before German forces could organize effective resistance. German defensive positions, thinly manned and poorly supplied, collapsed. Soldiers retreated through the storm, abandoning equipment they couldn't move, seeking any defensive position that offered shelter from both Soviet attacks and killing cold. The 1st Guards Cavalry, pressing their advantage, overran German rear areas, disrupting communications, capturing supply dumps, spreading chaos. December 8th brought the moment German commanders had dreaded and denied. Their intelligence assessments were catastrophically wrong. Reports flooded headquarters describing Soviet attacks across multiple sectors simultaneously, fresh divisions, not the exhausted remnants intelligence had predicted. Winter-equipped troops operating effectively in conditions that immobilized German forces. Coordinated attacks showing staff work and planning that suggested major operations, not desperate local counterattacks. Wehrmacht intelligence officers scrambled to understand where these Soviet forces had come from. How did the Soviets still have offensive capacity? Where had they been hiding these reserves? The answers wouldn't come for days or weeks. What mattered immediately was that the Eastern Front was collapsing in sectors, bending dangerously in others, and German forces lacked the reserves to stabilize the situation. December 11th marked the first major Soviet recapture. Istra, a town 40 kilometers west of Moscow. The battle for Istra demonstrated the changed tactical situation. German forces defending the town were veterans who'd fought across Poland, France, and 6 months in the Soviet Union. They were professional soldiers with excellent training and combat experience. But they were also freezing, hungry, exhausted, and defending positions they had occupied for days or weeks without adequate fortification. Soviet attackers, by contrast, were often fresh troops with winter gear and functioning weapons. The numerical balance favored neither side particularly, but the environmental and logistical balance favored the Soviets dramatically. German defenders fought with determination, but couldn't hold against sustained attacks by better-equipped forces. Istra fell after 2 days of combat. Soviet troops raised red flags over the town center and immediately pushed westward. December 15th brought breakthrough near Klin. T-34. Tanks of the 20th Army smashed through German positions in an attack that would have been routine in summer, but was remarkable in winter. The T-34s, designed with wide tracks that distributed weight and reduced ground pressure, could move through snow that stopped German panzers. Their diesel engines, though difficult to start in extreme cold, ran more reliably than gasoline engines once started. Soviet tank crews had learned to overcome the starting problems through various expedients, lighting fires beneath engines, draining oil and warming it before use, even chemical heating elements when available. German tank crews faced the same starting problems, but had fewer solutions. The result was battlefield mobility advantage to Soviet forces, an ironic reversal after 6 months of German mechanized superiority. The collapse near Klin triggered exactly what Hitler had feared: retreat becoming rout. German units, receiving permission to withdraw, or simply withdrawing without permission, abandoned positions and fell back westward. The retreat wasn't orderly. Units lost communication with headquarters. Supply columns intermixed with combat formations. Equipment was abandoned, trucks that wouldn't start, artillery pieces too heavy to move through snow, tanks immobilized by mechanical failure or lack of fuel. German soldiers burned vehicles to prevent Soviet capture, creating columns of black smoke that marked the retreat's trail. Some vehicles were destroyed properly, rendered unusable. Others were simply set alight, their military value intact under the flames, recovered by Soviet forces and sometimes put back into service after repairs. By late December, Soviet forces had pushed the German line back 100 to 250 kilometers across broad sectors of the front. This wasn't the lightning advance of German operations in summer, but it was real territorial recovery. More importantly, it was psychological victory. For the first time in World War II, German forces were retreating in large-scale, sustained withdrawal, not tactical repositioning, not consolidating gains, retreating, leaving behind the furthest points of advance, abandoning objectives they had fought and died to reach, falling back toward positions they had occupied weeks earlier. The Wehrmacht's aura of invincibility, carefully constructed through 2 years of victories, began to crack. If Germany could be defeated here, Could it be defeated elsewhere? German casualty figures for December told a story of catastrophe. Army Group Center lost approximately 145,000 men that month, killed, wounded, missing, or evacuated with frostbite. These losses represented roughly 1/6 of the entire force. Some divisions were effectively destroyed as combat formations, reduced to regimental or even battalion strength. The 7th Panzer Division, which began Operation Barbarossa with over 15,000 men, reported fewer than 3,000 effectives by year's end. The others were dead, wounded, captured, or frozen. Equipment losses exceeded personnel losses proportionally. Approximately 2,300 tanks were destroyed, damaged, or abandoned. 5,000 vehicles of all types were lost. 15,000 horses, the Wehrmacht's actual primary transport, died from exhaustion, starvation, or cold. Soviet tactics during the counteroffensive showed adaptation and learning. Night attacks became standard, exploiting German reluctance to fight in darkness and extreme cold. Soviet troops, equipped with better winter gear, could operate at night more effectively than Germans. Forest fighting, previously a Soviet weakness, improved dramatically. Siberian divisions, many from forested regions themselves, understood how to use forests for concealment and maneuver. Soviet artillery coordination became more effective, with rolling barrages supporting infantry advances in textbook combined arms operations. The Red Army that attacked in December 1941 was qualitatively different from the Red Army that had defended in June. It had learned from 6 months of defeats. It had adapted its tactics. It had found commanders who could coordinate complex operations. December 31st, 1941. Soviet forces continued advancing in some sectors, had stalled in others, but nowhere were they retreating. German forces had stabilized portions of the front through desperate fighting, but couldn't counterattack. The Eastern Front at year's end bore no resemblance to what German planners had envisioned in June. Moscow hadn't fallen. The Soviet Union hadn't collapsed. The Red Army, supposedly destroyed multiple times over according to German casualty claims, was conducting offensive operations across hundreds of kilometers. The Wehrmacht, supposedly invincible, was retreating. The military situation defied German assumptions so completely that commanders struggled to explain it to higher headquarters. How had everything gone wrong? The explanations varied: weather, logistics, Soviet treachery, bad luck. But none addressed the fundamental miscalculation. Germany had invaded a country too large, too populous, and too determined to be defeated in a single summer campaign. That miscalculation, that fundamental strategic error, was now consuming German armies in winter battles outside Moscow. December 16, 1941. Soviet forces recaptured Kalinin, modern Tver, opening a breach 150 kilometers wide in German defensive lines northwest of Moscow. The city's liberation represented more than tactical success. It demonstrated that Soviet offensive operations could achieve significant penetrations against prepared German defenses. Stalin, encouraged by success around Moscow, saw opportunity for something larger, not merely defending the capital, but destroying Army Group Center entirely, perhaps even driving German forces back to the pre-war frontier. On December 20th, he convened his military leadership at Stavka, the supreme headquarters, and proposed expanding the Moscow counteroffensive into a general offensive across the entire Eastern Front. The generals listened to Stalin's ambitious vision with mixed feelings. They knew what success around Moscow had cost: tens of thousands of casualties, massive ammunition expenditure, units pushed to exhaustion. Expanding operations would multiply those costs many times over. Stalin's plan for winter offensive operations was breathtaking in scope. Attacks would be launched from Leningrad in the north to the Black Sea in the south, a front of over 2,000 kilometers. Soviet forces would attack simultaneously in 6 different sectors: near Leningrad, around Moscow, toward Smolensk, in Ukraine, toward Kharkov, and in the Crimea. The objective wasn't limited tactical gains, but strategic transformation: destroy the Wehrmacht's offensive capacity entirely, recapture lost Soviet territory, perhaps even force German withdrawal from Soviet soil altogether. The plan's ambition exceeded Soviet military capacity, but Stalin believed momentum from Moscow could be extended indefinitely. His generals, those brave or foolish enough to voice concerns, suggested concentration of effort around Moscow, rather than dispersal across the entire front. Stalin rejected such advice. He believed Germany was on the verge of collapse. One more push across the entire front would achieve it. January 8, 1942, brought one of the war's most audacious and disastrous operations, a Soviet airborne assault behind German lines near Vyazma. 4,000 paratroopers boarded aircraft and dropped into German-held territory, aiming to disrupt communications and support a ground offensive from the east. The operation demonstrated impressive Soviet airborne capacity, but catastrophic tactical execution. German forces, though retreating, remained capable of coordinated defensive operations. The paratroopers, scattered across dozens of kilometers during the drop, couldn't concentrate effectively. German units hunted them systematically. Most Soviet paratroopers were killed or captured within days. A few survived, linking up with partisan groups operating behind German lines, but the operation achieved none of its objectives. The failed Vyazma drop highlighted the difference between Stalin's strategic vision and operational reality. Expanding operations required resources and capabilities the Red Army didn't possess. January 20th. Soviet 33rd Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Mikhail Efremov, penetrated 80 kilometers behind German lines west of Moscow. This deep penetration represented exactly the kind of breakthrough Stalin envisioned. Soviet forces driving deep into German rear areas, disrupting logistics, threatening encirclement. For a few weeks, the 33rd Army's advance looked like validation of Stalin's strategy. Then German forces counterattacked. The Wehrmacht, though weakened and retreating in many sectors, could still coordinate local counteroffensives. German units encircled the 33rd Army, cutting it off from Soviet supply lines. Efremov's forces fought desperately to break out, but German positions held. By April, the 33rd Army was destroyed. Efremov himself died fighting rather than surrender. The army that had advanced furthest, that had achieved the deepest penetration, was annihilated because Soviet logistics couldn't support deep operations. By February, the pattern was clear. Soviet offensives succeeded initially, advanced significant distances, then stalled when logistics failed and German defenses stabilized. The same problems that had plagued German operations in autumn now affected Soviet operations in winter. Advancing armies outran their supply lines. Artillery units exhausted ammunition faster than transportation could deliver replacements. Tank units that advanced rapidly found themselves without fuel or spare parts. Infantry that marched dozens of kilometers arrived at combat zones exhausted, unable to fight effectively. The Red Army had advantages the Wehrmacht lacked: fighting on interior lines, shorter supply routes, winter equipment, but it faced the same fundamental constraint. Mechanized warfare consumed resources faster than logistics could deliver them, especially across the vast distances of the Eastern Front. Casualty figures from the Winter Offensive revealed its true cost. Between December 1941 and March 1942, Soviet forces suffered approximately 1 million casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. These losses exceeded German casualties for the same period by a considerable margin. The exchange ratio favored Germany tactically, even while Germany retreated strategically. This was Soviet warfare's brutal arithmetic: accept casualties that would shatter Western armies, trade lives for time and space, exhaust the enemy through sheer numerical attrition. Soviet replacement systems could sustain million-man losses. German replacement systems couldn't. The question was whether Soviet society could tolerate such losses indefinitely. Whether Soviet logistics could sustain offensive operations, whether Soviet military leadership could learn to reduce casualties while maintaining offensive pressure. March 1942. The Winter Offensive had pushed German forces back 100 to 250 kilometers from Moscow across most sectors, but it had also created a massive German-held salient around Rzhev. The Rzhev salient bulged into Soviet territory, creating a potential springboard for renewed German offensive operations toward Moscow. Stalin ordered continuous attacks against the salient throughout spring and summer. These attacks, collectively known as the Rzhev meat grinder, would consume over 500,000 Soviet casualties through early 1943. The battles around Rzhev demonstrated both Soviet determination and Soviet casualties sustainability limits. Offensives were launched, achieved minimal gains, suffered enormous losses, and were renewed again weeks later. German defenders, well entrenched and supplied via shorter interior lines, inflicted horrific casualties on Soviet attackers. The strategic results of the expanded winter offensive fell far short of Stalin's expectations. German forces had been pushed back from Moscow, eliminating the immediate threat to the capital. But Germany hadn't collapsed. The Wehrmacht, though bloodied and weakened, stabilized defensive lines by late winter. Army Group Center remained intact as a fighting force, occupying positions within 200 kilometers of Moscow. The Soviet hope of driving Germans back to pre-war frontiers proved unrealistic. German logistics, though strained, hadn't collapsed entirely. German morale, though damaged, remained sufficient for defensive operations. Most importantly, the Wehrmacht demonstrated it could defend effectively even while retreating, inflicting casualties that made Soviet advances Pyrrhic victories. By April, as spring Rasputitsa transformed roads into mud again, both sides suspended major offensive operations. The front line had shifted westward from its December position, but was nowhere near the pre-Barbarossa frontier. Soviet forces held territory closer to Moscow, but German forces still threatened the capital from established positions. The winter campaign had demonstrated that Germany couldn't capture Moscow, but also that the Soviet Union couldn't expel Germany from Soviet territory through frontal offensives. The war had evolved into extended conflict, exactly what Hitler had wanted to avoid, and exactly what Soviet industrial capacity made survivable for the USSR. The Battle of Moscow was over in the sense that Moscow was no longer imminently threatened, but the war for Soviet survival was just beginning. The lessons from the expanded winter offensive were harsh. Soviet military leadership learned that success around Moscow didn't guarantee success everywhere, that logistics limited operations as much as enemy resistance, that casualties mattered even when replacements were available. Stalin learned that his strategic vision, however bold, couldn't overcome operational constraints. The Red Army learned that winning individual battles required more than courage and determination. It required coordination, logistics, and realistic objectives. These lessons, purchased with hundreds of thousands of lives, would shape Soviet operations for the remainder of the war. The winter offensive of 1941-42 was simultaneously Soviet salvation. Moscow survived, and Soviet instruction in warfare's brutal realities. The Eastern Front would continue, the casualties would mount, but the fundamental dynamic was established. Germany couldn't win a war of attrition against Soviet numerical superiority and industrial depth. December 16, 1941. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group Center, sent an urgent request to Hitler's headquarters requesting permission to withdraw to prepared defensive positions approximately 100 kilometers west of current front lines. The request was carefully worded, emphasizing military necessity rather than defeatism. Soviet counteroffensives were overwhelming forward positions. German units were suffering catastrophic losses from combat and cold. Retreating to shorter, more defensible lines would save what remained of Army Group Center's combat power. Hitler's response came swiftly and unambiguously. Request denied. There would be no general retreat. Units would hold current positions regardless of circumstances. The order stunned von Bock and his staff. Professional military logic argued for trading space for time, consolidating forces, establishing defensible lines. Hitler's logic operated differently. He believed retreat in winter conditions would become rout, that retreating soldiers would panic, that the entire front would collapse as it had for Napoleon's Grande Armée in 1812. December 18th, General Heinz Guderian, commanding 2nd Panzer Army, flew personally to Hitler's headquarters to request permission for tactical withdrawals. Guderian was Germany's foremost panzer commander, architect of the armored tactics that had conquered Poland and France, a soldier whose judgment on mechanized warfare was nearly unimpeachable. He brought detailed reports of his army's condition: frozen equipment, exhausted troops, unsustainable losses. He needed to withdraw to positions where his forces could be supplied and rested. Hitler listened to Guderian's presentation, then dismissed it. The conversation, recorded in Guderian's memoirs, captured the fundamental break between Hitler's strategic vision and his general's military judgment. "The troops must dig in where they stand and hold every square meter of ground," Hitler ordered. Guderian protested that troops couldn't dig in. The ground was frozen solid. Hitler didn't care. The order stood. Guderian returned to his command, knowing his army would be destroyed if he obeyed, and knowing he'd be relieved if he disobeyed. December 19th, 1941. Hitler issued his halt order, directive forbidding any retreat without his personal approval. The order was absolute, applying to every unit on the Eastern Front. Commanders requesting permission to withdraw would be relieved. Units retreating without permission would face military justice. Soldiers who abandoned positions would be shot. The order's severity reflected Hitler's conviction that willpower could overcome military reality. German soldiers had demonstrated superior training, equipment, and tactics throughout the war. They'd defeated every enemy they had faced. They could defeat Russian winter and Soviet numbers if they refused to yield. Retreat was psychological weakness, not military necessity. Hold the line, and Soviet attacks would exhaust themselves. Retreat, and panic would spread. Hitler's logic was internally consistent, but divorced from the Eastern Front's reality. That same evening, December 19th, Hitler made a command decision that would shape German military operations for the remainder of the war. He dismissed Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, Commander-in-Chief of the German Army, and assumed personal command himself. The move consolidated all strategic and operational authority in Hitler's hands. Previously, the Führer set strategic objectives while professional soldiers planned operations. Now, Hitler would direct operations personally. Professional military staff would implement his decisions, not recommend alternatives. The decision's implications terrified German officers. War required flexibility, adaptation to changing circumstances, delegation of authority to commanders at the front. Hitler's assumption of personal command centralized decisions that should be made by field commanders, delayed responses to tactical situations, and replaced professional military judgment with Hitler's intuitive strategic vision. January 1942 brought the purge. Over 35 senior German commanders were relieved of command for retreating against orders or requesting permission to retreat. The list included some of Germany's most capable generals. Guderian, dismissed. Hoepner, dismissed and expelled from the army. Strauss, dismissed. Von Bock, dismissed for medical reasons that everyone understood were pretextual. The message was clear: obey Hitler's no retreat order or face immediate relief. Some dismissed commanders accepted their fate silently. Others protested, arguing that Hitler's orders would destroy the Wehrmacht. Hitler didn't care. The Eastern Front required ideological determination, not professional military caution. Generals who lacked such determination would be replaced with commanders who possessed it. The halt order's consequences became apparent through winter. German units standing fast in indefensible positions suffered catastrophic casualties. The fighting around Ljev, where German forces held a salient against continuous Soviet attacks, consumed over 500,000 German casualties between January 1942 and March 1943. Divisions that might have retreated to defensible lines with minimal losses instead bled themselves to remnants defending positions that lacked strategic value. Yet, the Wehrmacht line overall held. Units decimated by combat and cold maintained positions through determination and discipline. Hitler's conviction that willpower could overcome circumstances proved partially correct. The line didn't collapse entirely as he'd feared retreat would cause. But the cost was devastating. Germany lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers defending positions that professional military judgment suggested should be abandoned. The strategic debate over whether Hitler's no-retreat order was brilliant or catastrophic continues among military historians. Arguments favoring the order, retreat in -40-degree conditions, might have become uncontrollable rout, as happened to Napoleon. The Wehrmacht lacked prepared defensive positions further west. Soviet forces might have pursued retreating Germans closely, preventing any organized defense. The psychological impact of retreat might have shattered German morale irreparably. Arguments against the order, tactical withdrawals to prepared positions, would have saved hundreds of thousands of casualties. Shorter defensive lines could be held by fewer troops, freeing reserves for counterattacks. Equipment abandoned during fighting withdrawals could have been saved through organized retreat. The truth likely lies between extremes. Hitler's order prevented complete collapse, but at a cost that Germany couldn't sustain indefinitely. By March 1942, total German casualties on the Eastern Front since June 22 exceeded 1.3 million, killed, wounded, missing, or dead from frostbite and disease. These losses represented roughly one-third of the force that had invaded the Soviet Union 9 months earlier. Replacement systems couldn't fill the gaps. New divisions raised in Germany lacked the training and experience of lost veteran units. The Wehrmacht that would fight in 1942 was qualitatively different from the Wehrmacht of the 1941. Fewer professionals, more conscripts, equipment shortages, depleted logistics. Hitler's no-retreat order had preserved the front line's integrity, but consumed the veteran army that had conquered Europe. The precedent established in winter 1941-42 would govern German operations for the war's remainder. Hitler's no-retreat order became standard policy, applied at Stalingrad with catastrophic results, applied in Normandy with similar outcomes. German commanders learned that requesting permission to retreat often led to relief of command. Better to hold impossible positions and be destroyed than retreat without authorization and face immediate dismissal. This command culture, prioritizing obedience over military effectiveness, contributed to numerous German disasters. Units that could have escaped encirclement stood fast and were destroyed. Positions that could have been abandoned without strategic consequence were defended to the last man. The Eastern Front became a grinding attrition battle that favored Soviet numerical superiority. December 1941 to March 1942 represented a transformation point for German military culture. The Wehrmacht entered the period as Europe's most successful military force, confident in its superiority, led by professional soldiers who understood their craft. It emerged as an army bound by Hitler's intuitive decision-making, where professional judgment was subordinated to ideological determination, where retreat was forbidden regardless of military logic. The army that had conquered Poland in weeks, France in months, and Yugoslavia in days was becoming an army that would die in place rather than adapt to circumstances. Hitler's halt order saved the Eastern Front from complete collapse in winter 1941, but it also locked Germany into a strategic approach that made future defeats inevitable. When retreat would have saved armies, Hitler's orders demanded they stand and be destroyed. The pattern established at Moscow would repeat at Stalingrad, Kursk, Normandy, the Bulge, and finally Berlin. The question wasn't whether Germany would lose, but how many soldiers would die before German commanders finally disobeyed the order to hold at all costs. March 15, 1942. General Mikhail Efremov transmitted his final radio message from the forests near Vyazma, where his 33rd Army had been surrounded for weeks. The message was brief, professional, resigned. Ammunition exhausted, food gone, no possibility of relief. Efremov requested permission to attempt a breakout. Stavka, the Soviet Supreme Headquarters, authorized the attempt, but couldn't provide support. German forces encircling the position were too strong. Soviet forces trying to reach Efremov from the outside were too weak. The 33rd Army, which had advanced 80 kilometers into German rear areas in January, was being methodically destroyed. Efremov led his remaining troops in a desperate breakout attempt on April 19th. Most were killed in the fighting. Efremov himself, wounded and unable to continue, shot himself rather than surrender. His death symbolized the Winter Offensive's ultimate failure, deep penetrations achieved but unsustainable, Victories won but uncompleted, lives sacrificed for territorial gains that couldn't be exploited. April 1942 brought the spring Rasputitsa again, the seasonal mud that had plagued German operations in October, now affecting Soviet offensives. Roads dissolved into impassable muck. Tracked vehicles bogged down. Supply columns stalled. The same environmental factors that had stopped the Wehrmacht in autumn now stopped the Red Army in spring. Soviet commanders, planning spring offensive operations to exploit winter's gains, watched helplessly as their armies literally sank into mud. Tanks that had advanced through frozen snow now sat immobilized, their wide tracks insufficient to overcome spring mud's adhesive quality. Artillery couldn't be moved forward to support attacks. Ammunition couldn't reach forward units in quantities sufficient for offensive operations. The front line stabilized, not because either side chose to halt, but because neither side could move effectively. April 20th, Stavka issued orders suspending major offensive operations on the Moscow axis. The directive, carefully worded to avoid acknowledging failure, emphasized consolidating gains and preparing for summer operations. In practice, it meant accepting that the winter offensive's ambitious objectives, destroying Army Group Center, driving Germans from Soviet territory, were unachievable. Soviet forces held positions 100 to 250 kilometers west of where they'd stood in November, but German forces remained dangerously close to Moscow, still within artillery range in some sectors. The Rizhev salient remained, a massive bulge of German-held territory pointing toward Moscow like a dagger. Soviet efforts to eliminate this salient had failed repeatedly despite enormous casualties. The front line around Moscow would remain essentially unchanged for another year. May 1942. German engineers, who'd spent the winter fighting for survival rather than building fortifications, began constructing proper defensive positions. Bunkers were excavated, reinforced with logs and earth. Minefields were laid, anti-tank obstacles constructed, communications trenches dug. These fortifications represented psychological shift as much as tactical preparation. The Wehrmacht, which had fought the entire war conducting offensive operations, was now preparing for sustained defense. The soldiers building these positions understood the implications. They wouldn't be advancing anymore, at least not here, not this year. The Eastern Front had become positional warfare, reminiscent of World War I, the kind of grinding attrition battle that favored the side with greater resources and manpower. That side was the Soviet Union, not Germany. Casualty statistics for the winter campaign revealed a stalemate's arithmetic. Soviet forces suffered approximately 1 million casualties between December and March, killed, wounded, missing. German forces suffered approximately 900,000 casualties in the same period. The exchange ratio slightly favored Germany tactically, but strategically the situation favored the Soviet Union. Soviet replacement systems could sustain million-casualty offensives. Soviet factories, evacuated to the Urals, were producing over 1,500 tanks monthly by spring. Soviet mobilization brought millions of new conscripts into the army. Germany had no equivalent resources. German replacement divisions lacked the quality of lost veteran units. German tank production lagged Soviet output significantly. German manpower, drawn from a population of 80 million, couldn't match Soviet mobilization from a population exceeding 190 million. The arithmetic of attrition favored the USSR. June 1942. Aerial reconnaissance photographed the front line around Moscow, documenting positions that had barely changed since February. The photographs showed defensive works on both sides, artillery positions, supply dumps, all the infrastructure of static warfare. The Battle of Moscow, in the sense of mobile operations threatening the capital, was over. What continued was attritional combat, raids, local attacks, artillery exchanges, the steady bleeding that characterized positional warfare. Soviet forces attacked the Rizhev salient repeatedly through summer, suffering enormous casualties for minimal gains. German forces defended stubbornly, taking heavy losses but holding their positions. Neither side could achieve breakthrough. The front had stabilized into mutual exhaustion. The Rizhev meat grinder, Soviet attacks on the German salient from January 1942 through March 1943 consumed over 2 million Soviet casualties, making it one of the war's bloodiest operations. These staggering losses, long obscured by Soviet historiography's focus on Stalingrad, represented Stalin's determination to eliminate the German threat to Moscow at any cost. Offensive after offensive was launched against well-prepared German defenses. Soviet tactics showed minimal sophistication, mass infantry assaults supported by artillery barrages, attempting to overwhelm German positions through sheer weight of numbers. German defenders, dug in and supported by their own artillery, inflicted horrific casualties. Some Soviet divisions lost 70 to 80% of their personnel in single operations, were withdrawn, rebuilt with replacements, and sent back into combat weeks later. The human cost of this stalemate was measured not just in casualties but in degradation of a combat effectiveness. Soviet divisions in April 1942 reported 20 to 30% strength despite being officially at full establishment. The discrepancy reflected replacement systems that counted raw recruits as equivalent to trained soldiers. A division at full numerical strength might have thousands of men who'd been in uniform for mere weeks, led by officers with minimal training themselves, equipped with weapons they barely knew how to operate. German divisions faced similar quality degradation. Replacements from Germany arrived with insufficient training. Veterans who'd survived the winter became exhausted shells of their former selves, their combat effectiveness eroded by months of continuous operations. Both armies were consuming themselves, becoming quantitatively stronger through replacement, but qualitatively weaker through exhaustion and dilution of veteran personnel. By summer 1942, the strategic situation around Moscow had crystallized into uncomfortable permanence. Moscow was safe. German forces lacked capability to renew offensive operations toward the capital, but Moscow wasn't secure. German forces remained within 150 kilometers, close enough to threaten, too close for Stalin's comfort. Soviet offensives had pushed the Wehrmacht back, but couldn't expel it from threatening range. The front line represented equilibrium of exhaustion. Neither side strong enough to advance decisively, both sides too weak to risk major operations. This stalemate would persist through 1942 and into 1943, finally breaking only when German strategic attention shifted south towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus. The Battle of Moscow concluded not with dramatic finale, but with gradual recognition that the decisive phase had passed. German armies wouldn't capture Moscow. Soviet armies wouldn't destroy Army Group Center. The front line around the capital had stabilized into attritional grinding that would continue for over a year, but wouldn't fundamentally change. The battle's true significance wouldn't be recognized for months or years. This was the moment Germany lost World War II. Not lost immediately, not lost obviously, but lost inevitably. The failure to capture Moscow meant Germany faced extended war against the Soviet Union while fighting Britain and soon the United States. The arithmetic of such multi-front war was unsustainable for German resources. Germany could win battles. Germany could inflict staggering casualties. But Germany couldn't win a war of attrition against enemies with greater industrial capacity and larger populations. Moscow was where that reality became apparent to anyone willing to see it. The question wasn't whether Germany would lose, but how long defeat would take and how many would die before it arrived. Summer 1942. Berlin. Albert Speer, recently appointed Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, presented production statistics to Adolf Hitler. The numbers told an uncomfortable story. Soviet industrial output, despite losing territories containing 60% of pre-war capacity, exceeded German production in key military categories. Soviet factories produced approximately 24,446 tanks in 1942. German factories produced 9,300. Soviet aircraft production reached 25,436 versus German production of 15,556. The disparity in artillery production was even more dramatic. Speer's presentation included detailed analysis explaining why. Soviet industry was fully mobilized for war production, while German industry still produced substantial consumer goods. Hitler listened but rejected Speer's implicit recommendation for total economic mobilization. Germany needed to maintain civilian morale. The war would be short, no need for measures that would strain German society unnecessarily. June 1942. Tankograd, the nickname for Chelyabinsk's massive industrial complex, was producing 400 T-34 tanks monthly from factories evacuated from Ukrainian and Russian cities the previous year. The production achievement was remarkable not just for its scale, but for the speed with which evacuated industries had resumed operations. Factories disassembled under German artillery fire in summer 1941 were producing at full capacity by summer 1942. The workers operating these production lines worked 12-hour shifts, 6 or 7 days weekly, in conditions that would have violated every labor regulation in peacetime. Many were women, children, and elderly men. Everyone physically capable of industrial labor was mobilized. The ration system kept workers minimally fed. Housing was inadequate. Medical care was limited. But the tanks kept rolling off the production lines, shipped westward to replace losses, equip new formations, sustain the attritional warfare consuming armor at horrific rates. The production comparison between Soviet and German economies revealed fundamental strategic asymmetry. The Soviet Union operated a command economy where central planners could redirect all resources toward war production instantly. Consumer goods production essentially ceased. Everything, steel, rubber, electrical components, skilled labor, went to military purposes. Germany, by contrast, maintained substantial civilian production through 1942 and even into 1943. Hitler believed maintaining civilian living standards was essential for morale. This decision, economically rational in peacetime, was strategically catastrophic in total war. Every resource devoted to civilian consumption was a resource unavailable for military production. The cumulative effect over months and years gave the Soviet Union decisive quantitative advantages in tanks, aircraft, and artillery. Spring 1942 brought German military intelligence assessment acknowledging the stunning misjudgment. The enemy's capacity for resistance far exceeded our expectations. This bureaucratic language concealed a devastating admission. German invasion planning had assumed the Soviet Union's military-industrial capacity would collapse when Western territories were captured. The opposite occurred. Soviet production increased after evacuation, not despite it. German intelligence officers struggled to explain this to higher command. How did Soviet industry recover so quickly? How were Soviet factories in the Urals producing more than factories in the Ukraine had produced before the war? The answers existed in intelligence reports: the evacuation, the total economic mobilization, the command economy's flexibility. But these facts contradicted assumptions underlying Operation Barbarossa. Acknowledging them meant acknowledging that Germany's strategic planning had been fundamentally flawed. Population arithmetic was equally unfavorable for Germany. The Soviet Union, even after German occupation of Western territories, retained population exceeding 190 million in areas beyond German control. Germany had approximately 80 million. Romania, Hungary, Italy, and other Axis allies added perhaps 50 million. But these populations couldn't be mobilized as thoroughly as Soviet population. German military planners calculated replacement rates based on population size and mobilization efficiency. The mathematics were stark. Soviet armies could absorb and replace losses that would cripple German forces. A German division destroyed required months or years to reconstitute with equivalent quality personnel. A Soviet division destroyed could be replaced numerically in weeks. Quality suffered. Replacement troops lacked training and experience, but quantity provided its own quality. 3 mediocre Soviet divisions could defeat 1 excellent German division through sheer weight of numbers. Oil production presented another arithmetic problem favoring the USSR. Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus and around Baku produced sufficient petroleum for Soviet military needs despite German advances. Germany depended on Romanian oil fields and synthetic fuel production, both vulnerable and insufficient for extended war. German panzer divisions in 1942 operated under constant fuel constraints. Soviet tank formations, while also fuel-limited, had shorter supply lines and more secure oil sources. The strategic implications were clear. Germany couldn't sustain mechanized warfare at the scale the Eastern Front required. Every tank, every aircraft, every truck consumed fuel Germany struggled to provide. Soviet logistics faced similar challenges, but from a position of greater overall supply. The arithmetic of oil was slowly strangling German mobile warfare. German casualty replacement presented perhaps the starkest arithmetic problem. The Wehrmacht needed to maintain approximately 3 million men on the Eastern Front to hold current positions and conduct operations. Casualties, killed, wounded, permanently disabled, averaged approximately 150,000 monthly through 1942. That rate required replacements of 1.8 million annually. German training systems could produce those numbers, barely, but couldn't match the quality of personnel being lost. Pre-war professional soldiers and NCOs were being replaced with hastily trained conscripts. The Wehrmacht of 1943 would be numerically similar to the Wehrmacht of 1941, but qualitatively inferior. Experience, the accumulated knowledge of successful military operations, was bleeding away faster than it could be replaced through training. Soviet replacement systems operated on different principles. Casualties were staggering, often exceeding 200,000 monthly. But the Soviet Union's larger population and more ruthless mobilization sustained replacement flows. Soviet training standards were minimal by German standards. A conscript might receive weeks of basic training before assignment to a frontline unit. Quality was abysmal by professional military standards, but the system's throughput exceeded German replacement systems decisively. The Red Army could sustain offensive operations despite horrific casualties because it could replace losses faster than Germany. This wasn't sophisticated strategy. It was arithmetic applied ruthlessly. Trade Soviet lives at unfavorable ratios, sustain such trading through superior numbers, eventually exhaust German capacity to replace losses. The strategic reserve disparity was equally telling. The Soviet Union retained substantial forces in the Far East defending against possible Japanese attack, approximately 30 divisions, around 500,000 men. Germany was fully committed on the Eastern Front in North Africa and occupying Western Europe. No strategic reserve existed for unforeseen contingencies. When crises emerged, Stalingrad, Kursk, Normandy, Germany had no uncommitted forces to deploy. The Soviet Union could shift forces from the Far East when Japanese threat diminished. This reserve capacity provided Stalin strategic flexibility Hitler lacked. Germany fought with every available division. The Soviet Union fought with most available divisions while retaining a strategic reserve for emergencies. The arithmetic that mattered most, the kill ratio required for German victory, was never achievable. German forces needed to inflict casualties at approximately 10-to-1 ratios to offset Soviet numerical and industrial advantages. Actual combat ratios varied between 1-to-1 and 3-to-1 in Germany's favor, depending on tactical situation. These ratios, while favoring Germany tactically, were strategically insufficient. Germany needed to destroy Soviet armies faster than Soviet industry, and mobilization could replace them. That threshold was never reached, not in summer 1941 during the initial invasion, not in winter during the Moscow battle, not in any subsequent operation. The Red Army suffered catastrophic casualties repeatedly, but never collapsed completely. New divisions appeared to replace destroyed divisions. New tanks replaced destroyed tanks. The arithmetic was inexorable. Soviet capacity to sustain losses exceeded German capacity to inflict them at rates sufficient for decisive victory. German military leadership understood this arithmetic by mid-1942, but couldn't acknowledge it publicly. Acknowledging that Germany couldn't win mathematically meant acknowledging that invasion of the Soviet Union was strategic error. That acknowledgement would undermine the entire war effort. So, the war continued, driven by Hitler's refusal to accept mathematical reality, sustained by German military professionalism and soldiers' courage. Bleeding Germany, white against an enemy that could replace losses Germany couldn't match. The Battle of Moscow was where the arithmetic became apparent. The subsequent 2.5 years of Eastern Front combat were the working out of that arithmetic's implications. Germany would win brilliant tactical victories. German soldiers would demonstrate courage and skill, unmatched by any army in the world. But they would lose because the numbers never worked, because the arithmetic of annihilation favored the Soviet Union, because Germany had started a war it couldn't win through military means alone. The mathematics were clear to anyone willing to calculate honestly. Germany needed either political collapse of the Soviet Union, which showed no signs of occurring, or military victory achieved before Soviet numerical advantages became decisive. Moscow was the last realistic opportunity for such victory. That opportunity was lost in the snow and cold outside the Soviet capital in winter 1941-42, December the 7th, 1941. While Soviet forces launched their counteroffensive around Moscow, Japanese aircraft attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The historical coincidence, the two events separated by hours and occurring on opposite sides of the globe, would prove strategically consequential. The Japanese attack transformed American public opinion overnight. Isolationism, the dominant sentiment in American politics through 1941, evaporated in the fury following Pearl Harbor. The United States would enter World War II, inevitably bringing American industrial capacity into the conflict against the Axis powers. For the Soviet Union, fighting desperately for survival, American entry meant potential aid, future support, eventual relief from bearing the entire burden of fighting Nazi Germany. The war was becoming truly global, and the Battle of Moscow was occurring at precisely the moment when global alignments were crystallizing. December 11th, 1941. Adolf Hitler, in one of history's most consequential strategic errors, declared war on the United States. The decision was not required by Germany's alliance with Japan. The tripartite pact obligated Germany to support Japan only if Japan were attacked, not if Japan attacked others. Hitler chose to declare war anyway, believing American entry into the European war was inevitable, and preferring to strike first through unrestricted submarine warfare. The decision, made while the Moscow disaster was unfolding, eliminated any possibility of Germany focusing solely on the Soviet Union. Now, Germany would fight the USSR, Britain, and the United States simultaneously. The industrial might of all three nations combined exceeded Germany's capacity by an order of magnitude. The mathematics of victory, already unfavorable, became impossible. January 1st, 1942. Representatives of 26 nations signed the declaration by United Nations in Washington, pledging to fight the Axis powers until complete victory. The Soviet Union was a co-equal signatory, no longer an isolated power fighting for survival, but a member of the Grand Alliance against fascism. This diplomatic transformation mattered strategically. Stalin, who'd signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler in 1939, who'd divided Poland with Nazi Germany, who'd supplied Germany with raw materials through mid-1941, was now an Allied leader. The Western powers, Britain and the United States, would provide military aid to the USSR. More importantly, they would eventually open a second front in Europe, forcing Germany to divide its forces between East and West. The Battle of Moscow occurred at the moment when the Soviet Union's diplomatic position was transforming from isolation to alliance. Spring 1942 brought British war cabinet debates about opening a second front in Europe. Soviet diplomatic pressure was intense. Stalin wanted Anglo-American forces landing in France, drawing German divisions away from the Eastern Front. British military planners, remembering the catastrophic losses of World War I, counseled caution. Cross-channel invasion required enormous preparation. American forces were still mobilizing. German defenses along the French coast were formidable. Opening a second front prematurely risked disaster. Yet, the strategic logic was compelling. As long as Germany fought only on the Eastern Front, all Wehrmacht strength could focus on the USSR. A second front would force Germany to divide forces, reducing pressure on Soviet armies. The debate over second front timing would dominate Allied strategic planning through 1943. Lend-Lease, the American program providing military aid to allies, underwent massive expansion for Soviet benefit. Aid to the USSR jumped from $41 million in 1941 to $1.4 billion in 1942. American factories produced trucks, aircraft, ammunition, food, raw materials, everything Soviet industry couldn't produce in sufficient quantities. The aid's impact on Soviet war-making capacity was substantial if delayed. Most Lend-Lease equipment arrived in 1943 and 1944, too late for the Moscow battle, but critical for subsequent operations. The long-term effect was liberating Soviet industry to focus on weapons production, tanks, artillery, aircraft, while American production supplied trucks, locomotives, food, and other support materials. This division of industrial labor multiplied Soviet military effectiveness. British intelligence assessments underwent radical revision after Moscow. Through autumn 1941, British intelligence estimated the Soviet Union would collapse or negotiate peace before winter ended. MI6 reports predicted Moscow's fall, German victory, Soviet capitulation. These assessments shaped British strategic planning. Don't rely on the Soviets, they won't last. The Moscow counteroffensive shattered those predictions. By February 1942, British intelligence was projecting Soviet survival and eventual participation in Germany's defeat. This reassessment changed everything. Britain wouldn't fight Germany alone indefinitely. Soviet survival meant Germany faced multi-front war. Ultimate Allied victory became plausible, not merely hopeful. The intelligence revision reflected hard evidence. German forces were retreating. Soviet forces were attacking. The supposedly defeated Red Army was conducting large-scale offensive operations. The diplomatic crisis among Axis nations following Moscow was less visible but equally significant. Romania, Hungary, Finland. All had committed forces to Operation Barbarossa, expecting quick German victory. By spring 1942, their troops had suffered heavy casualties in a war that showed no signs of ending. Romanian divisions on the Eastern Front had been decimated. Hungarian forces questioned why they were dying in Russia. Finnish leaders, who joined the war to reclaim territory lost to the Soviets and continue with the remaining chapters, 11:55 a.m. 1939-40, began considering separate peace once their territorial objectives were achieved. Germany's allies were losing confidence in German victory, questioning their continued participation, seeking diplomatic escape routes. Hitler's response was predictable, demanding renewed commitment, threatening consequences for wavering, denying that Moscow represented any significant setback. Public opinion in occupied Europe responded to Moscow with renewed resistance hope. German occupation forces controlled most of continental Europe from France to Ukraine. Resistance movements existed but operated cautiously. Knowing German reprisals were savage, news of German defeat at Moscow, spread through underground newspapers and BBC broadcasts, suggested German invincibility was myth. If the Wehrmacht could be defeated in Russia, perhaps it could be defeated elsewhere. Resistance activities increased through 1942, sabotage, intelligence gathering, attacks on occupation forces. The German response was predictably brutal, but the psychological shift was irreversible. Occupied populations who'd accepted German victory as inevitable now questioned that assumption. Japanese strategic vindication came at Soviet expense but ultimate Axis cost. Japan's decision to attack south towards Southeast Asia and the Pacific rather than north against Soviet Siberia looked prescient after Pearl Harbor. Japanese forces seized resource-rich territories in Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines. But the decision also meant Japan fighting the United States rather than supporting Germany against the USSR. If Japan had attacked Siberia in June 1941, coordinating with German invasion from the West, the strategic pressure on the Soviet Union would have been unbearable. Stalin couldn't have transferred Siberian divisions to defend Moscow. The Far East would have required major forces, stripping the Moscow defenses. Germany and Japan never coordinated their strategic planning effectively. Japan's focus on the Pacific rather than Eurasia meant the Soviet Union fought Germany without simultaneously fighting Japan, a decisive strategic advantage. The Battle of Moscow's occurrence at the moment of global war's crystallization shaped its historical significance. In isolation, Moscow was a Soviet defensive victory and German defeat. In context, Moscow occurred when the USSR joined the Grand Alliance, when American industrial power entered the war, when the conflict's global dimensions became apparent. The combination of factors transformed the war's trajectory. Germany now faced enemies whose combined population exceeded 1 billion people, whose combined industrial capacity outmatched German production by factors of 5 or 10, whose combined resources made German defeat inevitable, barring some dramatic political collapse. That collapse never came. Stalin's Soviet Union, despite enormous casualties and territorial losses, never sought negotiated peace. Churchill's Britain, despite years of solitary fighting, never wavered. Roosevelt's America, aroused by Pearl Harbor, mobilized completely. The coalition that would ultimately destroy Nazi Germany was forming in December 1941, at the precise moment when German forces were retreating from Moscow. The historical coincidence was more than symbolic. It marked the war's turning point toward inevitable Allied victory. May 1945, Flensburg, Germany. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed Germany's unconditional surrender, ending the European War. In the years following, Allied interrogators questioned surviving German military leaders about when they'd realized the war was lost. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, one of Germany's most senior commanders, gave an answer that historians would quote for decades. "I realized the war was lost when we failed to take Moscow in 1941. Other generals gave different answers: Stalingrad, Kursk, Normandy. But Rundstedt's judgment reflected professional military assessment, divorced from Nazi ideology. Moscow was the moment when German victory became impossible. Even if German defeat wasn't yet certain, everything afterward was prolonging the inevitable, fighting battles Germany couldn't win, strategically even while winning them tactically. 1943 brought German strategic planning sessions that revealed Moscow's long-term impact. Wehrmacht staff officers prepared plans for summer operations, assessing available forces and possible objectives. Conspicuously absent from these plans, any operation targeting Moscow again. The German Army High Command understood that Army Group Center lacked capability to renew offensive operations toward the Soviet capital. The forces that had come within 22 kilometers of the Kremlin in December 1941 would never threaten Moscow again. German planning focused on southern objectives, Stalingrad, the Caucasus oil fields, because Moscow was permanently beyond reach. The shift represented strategic bankruptcy. Germany couldn't threaten the Soviet capital anymore, couldn't force decisive battle on favorable terms, couldn't achieve the knockout blow that might have forced Soviet capitulation. December 1942. The Sixth Army's encirclement at Stalingrad demonstrated consequences of lessons not learned at Moscow. Hitler's no-retreat order, which had arguably prevented complete collapse outside Moscow a year earlier, now trapped 300,000 German soldiers in an untenable position. Professional military judgment argued for breakout while retreat was still possible. Hitler forbade it, demanding the Sixth Army hold Stalingrad at all costs. The army was destroyed, surrendering in February 1943 after suffering catastrophic casualties and losing irreplaceable combat power. The parallels to Moscow were exact. Unrealistic orders from Hitler, professional military judgment overruled, German forces destroyed, holding positions that should have been evacuated. The difference was scale. Stalingrad destroyed one army, while Moscow's Winter Campaign bled Army Group Center without destroying it completely. The casualty analysis comparing Moscow to subsequent Eastern Front battles illuminated the Winter Campaign's impact. At Moscow, the Wehrmacht lost approximately 900,000 troops, killed, wounded, missing, or evacuated with frostbite. Between October 1941 and March 1942, these losses represented roughly one-third of Army Group Center's strength and included a disproportionate number of pre-war professional soldiers and NCOs. These personnel were irreplaceable not in numerical terms, but in quality terms. Germany could train new soldiers, but it couldn't recreate the professional military culture developed over decades. Subsequent battles, Stalingrad, Kursk, the retreat through 1944, consumed additional hundreds of thousands of casualties. But the critical bleeding of professional competence occurred at Moscow. Equipment losses at Moscow established patterns that would doom German mechanized warfare. 2,300 tanks destroyed or abandoned in winter 1941-42 represented losses German production couldn't quickly replace. More critically, tank losses at Moscow consumed Germany's pre-war inventory of proven designs. Replacement tanks in 1942 and 43 were often new models rushed into production, Panthers, Tigers, mechanically unreliable, and produced in insufficient numbers. The Wehrmacht's Panzer Arm never recovered the numerical strength it possessed in June 1941. Soviet tank forces, by contrast, expanded continuously from 1942 onward. The quantitative balance shifted decisively toward the USSR after Moscow and never shifted back. The professional judgment question, which losses are measurable versus immeasurable, was central to assessing Moscow's impact. Measurable losses: 900,000 casualties, 2,300 tanks, 5,000 vehicles, 15,000 horses. These numbers were significant but not necessarily decisive. Germany replaced the losses numerically, if not qualitatively, and continued fighting for 3 more years. Immeasurable losses, the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility, German soldiers' confidence in ultimate victory, Hitler's strategic judgment, credibility among professional officers, the tempo and initiative in Eastern Front operations. These intangible losses couldn't be quantified, but shaped everything afterward. German soldiers after Moscow fought with skill and courage, but they fought defensively, reactively, without the supreme confidence that had characterized 1941 operations. Counterfactual analysis, what if Germany had captured Moscow, remained subject to historical debate decades later. The question's military dimension had clear answers. Capturing Moscow would have been a devastating symbolic blow, would have disrupted Soviet command and communications, would have validated Hitler's strategic vision, might have forced Stalin to relocate his government eastward. But would it have ended the war? Most historians argued no. The Soviet government could have continued from Kuibyshev or another eastern city. Soviet industry was already evacuated beyond German reach. The Red Army, though badly damaged, remained intact as a fighting force. Japanese neutrality meant Soviet Far East divisions could still transfer westward. Capturing Moscow in autumn 1941 might have prolonged German occupation of Soviet territory, but probably wouldn't have forced Soviet surrender. The counterfactual's diplomatic dimension was murkier. Would Soviet defeat at Moscow have prevented American entry into European war, weakened the Grand Alliance, enabled separate peace? Possible, but unlikely given Hitler's racial ideology and stated war aims. The timing counterfactual, what if Germany had attacked Moscow in July rather than October, was the most plausible alternative history. If Hitler hadn't diverted forces to Ukraine in August, if Army Group Center had driven directly to Moscow in July, the Wehrmacht would have attacked before autumn rains. Before the Siberian divisions arrived, before Soviet defenses were fully prepared, this scenario was Germany's best chance for capturing Moscow. Whether capturing the city in summer would have changed the war's outcome remains speculative, but it certainly offered better prospects than the actual October offensive into autumn Rasputitsa and Russian winter. The strategic error was Hitler's, delaying Moscow offensive for Ukrainian objectives, then launching the delayed offensive too late in the season. The turning point identification problem, can decisive moments be recognized contemporaneously or only retrospectively, was central to Moscow's historical interpretation. In December 1941, as German forces retreated from Moscow, few observers recognized they were witnessing the war's turning point. Most expected fighting to continue through 1942 with uncertain outcome. Stalin remained anxious about renewed German offensives. Hitler remained confident that temporary setbacks could be overcome. Allied leaders hoped Soviet survival was permanent, but couldn't be certain. The turning point was visible only retrospectively, after subsequent events revealed that Germany would never again threaten Moscow, never regain strategic initiative permanently, never achieved the quick victory that was essential for German success. Stalingrad, occurring a year later, was more dramatic and received more historical attention. But Moscow was the actual turning point, where German victory became impossible. The Battle of Moscow's significance lay not in spectacular drama, but in strategic mathematics quietly becoming apparent. Germany couldn't capture the Soviet capital. Germany couldn't destroy the Red Army. Germany couldn't force Soviet surrender. Germany couldn't win the war. These truths, barely visible in December 1941, became progressively clearer through 1942 and 1943 until they were undeniable even to Hitler's inner circle. The battle didn't end with climactic finale, but with gradual recognition that everything afterward was denouement. German forces would fight brilliantly for 3 more years. German soldiers would demonstrate courage and skill unsurpassed in military history. But they would lose because the war was already lost at Moscow, in the snow and cold outside the Soviet capital, where the Wehrmacht's advance stopped and never restarted, where the myth of German invincibility died, even if German fighting capacity remained formidable. Moscow was the point of no return, the moment when Germany's path led inexorably toward Berlin, 1945, an unconditional surrender. Everything afterward was working out the implications of that moment when Field Marshal von Rundstedt realized the war was lost. December 1941. Moscow. Anastasia Volkova stood in her apartment, listening to artillery fire for the first time in her life. The sounds came from the west, not close enough to threaten her building, but close enough to hear clearly in quiet moments. She was 32 years old, a schoolteacher before the war, now working in a munitions factory. Her husband was at the front. She hadn't heard from him in weeks. Her 2 children had been evacuated to the Urals in August. She lived alone in an apartment that had housed 6 family members before the war. Every boom from the west reminded her that German forces were close, impossibly close, that her city might fall at any moment. She'd volunteered for civil defense training, learning how to fight fires from incendiary bombs, how to identify German aircraft, how to operate a rifle if street fighting reached her neighborhood. The training seemed absurd. How would civilians with rifles stop the Wehrmacht that had conquered all of Europe? But it gave her something to do besides wait and worry. November 1941. Eastern Front. A German soldier, whose name was lost to history, wrote a letter to his mother that he never sent. Soviet forces recovered it from his body after a battle near Tula. The letter described his life in conditions he struggled to articulate. The cold here is beyond anything you can imagine. We wrap ourselves in everything we can find: Soviet coats, blankets, pieces of canvas. It doesn't help. The cold penetrates everything. Men are dying not from Russian bullets, but from freezing. Yesterday I saw a soldier lie down in the snow and simply give up. We tried to make him stand, but he refused. He died overnight. I don't think I'll see home again, Mother. If this letter reaches you, know that I thought of you at the end. I'm sorry I came to this country. I'm sorry I believed what they told us about quick victory. Tell Father I tried to be brave. The letter was one of thousands recovered from German dead. Personal documents that revealed the human reality behind casualty statistics. December 1941. Soviet front lines. Lieutenant Pavel Ivanovich led his platoon through a forest at -40 degrees Celsius, attacking German positions at dawn. Half his men were teenagers, conscripted in October, given 3 weeks of training, and sent to the front. They didn't know how to maintain their rifles properly in extreme cold. They didn't understand small unit tactics, but they advanced when ordered because the alternative was being shot by commissars for cowardice. Ivanovich watched them move through the snow, young men whose names he barely knew, knowing that most would die within days or weeks. He was 26 years old, a veteran of the Finnish War, ancient by the standards of his platoon. He'd survived because he'd learned to be careful, to use terrain, to avoid unnecessary risks. But he couldn't teach his men those lessons. They'd learn through experience, or they'd die. Most would die. His job was to keep enough alive to take the German positions they'd been assigned to capture. January 1942. Occupied Soviet territory. Maria Petrovna hid in her cellar while German and Soviet forces fought in her village. She was 63 years old, too old to evacuate, too stubborn to leave the house her family had lived in for generations. The fighting lasted 2 days. German forces retreated, Soviet forces advanced. Both armies took what they needed from civilian stores: food, clothing, shelter. Neither army was particularly gentle about it. Maria emerged from her cellar to find her house damaged by artillery fire, her winter food stocks requisitioned by soldiers, her village depopulated. Most residents had fled east with Soviet forces or been forced west by German retreat. She was one of perhaps 20 people remaining from a village that had housed 300 before the war. The war's human cost wasn't just soldiers dying. It was civilians displaced, homes destroyed, communities shattered, lives disrupted beyond recovery. The casualty statistics for the Battle of Moscow conveyed scope but not texture. Approximately 1.9 million combined casualties, 650,000 to 900,000 German, 1 to 1.3 million Soviet. These numbers represented individual deaths, individual wounds, individual families destroyed. Behind each number was a name, a life, a story. The German soldier who froze to death waiting for winter uniforms that never arrived. The Soviet teenager killed in his first battle, unnamed and unremembered except as a number in casualty reports. The partisan fighter who died sabotaging German supply lines behind the front. The civilian who starved when food supplies were diverted to military use. The numbers were almost incomprehensible. Nearly 2 million people killed, wounded, or missing in less than 6 months of fighting around a single city. Civilian casualties received less attention than military losses, but represented tragedy of equal magnitude. Approximately 200,000 Soviet civilians died in Moscow's defensive zone, from combat, starvation, cold, disease. The civilian death toll included those killed in German bombing raids on Moscow, those who starved when food supplies failed, those who froze during winter without adequate fuel or shelter, those executed by German forces in occupied territories. Soviet records documented these deaths with bureaucratic precision when possible, but many civilians died unrecorded, their fates unknown to families, their graves unmarked. The war consumed civilian lives as casually as military lives, making no distinction between combatant and non-combatant in its arithmetic of destruction. Prisoner of war mortality revealed the war's inhuman character. German prisoners captured during the winter counteroffensive faced 85 to 95% mortality rates in the first year of captivity. Soviet captivity was brutal under any circumstances. Inadequate food, minimal medical care, harsh labor. But winter 1941 to 42 was especially deadly. Soviet logistics could barely supply their own troops. Prisoners received whatever remained after military needs were met, which often meant nothing. German prisoners froze, starved, succumbed to disease in camps that were effectively death camps through neglect rather than design. Soviet prisoners in German hands faced similar or worse conditions, deliberately starved under Nazi racial ideology that viewed Slavs as subhuman. German policy toward Soviet POWs was explicitly exterminationist. Prisoners were worked to death, starved deliberately, murdered outright. Approximately 3.3 million Soviet POWs died in German captivity during the war, representing over half of all Soviet prisoners taken. Orphan children represented war's legacy for the next generation. Moscow's orphanages were overwhelmed with children whose parents died defending the city. Some were military orphans, fathers killed at the front. Others lost both parents to bombing, starvation, disease. Soviet authorities established state orphanages, providing minimal care and education, preparing orphans for productive participation in Soviet society. These children grew up without families, raised by the state, their childhood defined by war's deprivations. They were the lucky ones who survived. Countless other children died with their parents or died alone, forgotten casualties of a war that consumed entire communities. The penalty battalions, Strafbats, represented Soviet system's brutality toward its own soldiers. These units were composed of soldiers accused of cowardice, political unreliability, or military crimes. Assignment to a Strafbat was effectively a death sentence. The units were given the most dangerous assault missions, clearing minefields, spearheading attacks against prepared positions, any mission where casualties were expected to be total. Soldiers could redeem themselves through blood, earning return to regular units by surviving suicide missions. Most didn't survive. The Strafbat system terrorized the Red Army into fighting. Better to face German fire advancing than Soviet firing squads retreating. While simultaneously disposing of soldiers the system deemed unreliable. The human cost was measured in tens of thousands of soldiers killed in penal battalions, their deaths often unrecorded except as casualties of unnamed assault units. Frostbite casualties exceeded 250,000 combined German and Soviet troops. These weren't deaths, but maimings. Soldiers losing fingers, toes, feet, hands, sometimes entire limbs to freezing. The casualties required medical treatment that strained both German and Soviet medical systems. Field hospitals designed for combat wounds faced cases requiring amputation, long-term care, specialized treatment for cold injuries. Many frostbite victims survived, but with permanent disabilities that ended their military service and left them dependent on disability pensions and state care. The human cost continued long after the battle ended. Men in their 20s crippled for life, their productive years stolen by cold, as surely as others' lives were stolen by bullets. The psychological trauma for survivors received no recognition in 1942. Modern understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder didn't exist. Soldiers who survived months of combat, who'd seen comrades die, who'd killed enemies at close range, who'd experienced privations beyond civilian comprehension, were expected to simply continue fighting. Many broke psychologically. Soviet and German records document soldiers who became non-functional, who couldn't sleep, who trembled uncontrollably, who wept without cause. These men were often classified as cowards rather than trauma victims. Soviet forces sometimes shot them. German forces sent them to psychiatric facilities or simply discharged them as unfit. The psychological damage was real, permanent, and went entirely untreated by militaries that valued combat effectiveness over soldier welfare. The question of measuring worth, can any strategic objective justify this scale of human suffering, was philosophical rather than military. Military planners assessed the Moscow battle in strategic terms. Soviet capital defended successfully. German offensive capacity broken. Turning point in the war. These assessments were correct as military analysis. But the human cost, nearly 2 million military casualties, hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths, millions displaced, countless lives shattered permanently, demanded different evaluation. Was Moscow's defense worth this price? From Stalin's perspective, obviously yes. Soviet state survival required defending the capital. From Hitler's perspective, obviously yes. Capturing Moscow might have won the war. From the soldier's perspective, German teenagers freezing to death far from home, Soviet conscripts thrown into battle with minimal training, the question was more troubling. They paid the price for their leaders' decisions, dying for objectives they barely understood in a war they hadn't chosen. The human ledger of the Battle of Moscow balanced strategic significance against catastrophic human cost, a calculation that yielded different answers depending on whose humanity one counted and whose objectives one valued. 1943. Wehrmacht, Staff College, Germany. German officers studied the Battle of Moscow as a case study in what not to do. The curriculum, developed by staff officers who'd survived the Winter Campaign, focused on logistics. An army's operational reach is determined by its supply lines, not its tactical capabilities. German armor had reached Moscow's outskirts but couldn't advance further because fuel and ammunition couldn't reach forward units. The lesson was elementary military science, taught in every staff college for centuries. Yet Operation Barbarossa's planning had essentially ignored it. German logistics calculations assumed Soviet collapse before supply lines became critical. When that collapse didn't occur, logistics limited operations more decisively than Soviet resistance. The staff college lectures emphasized this point repeatedly. Though students recognized the bitter irony, They were learning lessons after the strategic decisions that ignored those lessons had already doomed Germany. 1950s. NATO headquarters, Western Europe. Cold War military planners studied the Battle of Moscow for insights on defending Western Europe against potential Soviet attack. The operational lessons were applicable: extended supply lines vulnerable to disruption, importance of strategic reserves, defensive depth allowing trading space for time, weather and terrain as force multipliers. NATO defensive planning incorporated these lessons explicitly. Alliance strategy emphasized mobile defense, counterattacks against penetrations, using European geography to channel Soviet advances, maintaining reserves for counteroffensive operations. The Battle of Moscow provided template for how numerically inferior forces might defeat larger attackers through superior logistics, preparation, and willingness to accept temporary territorial losses. The irony wasn't lost on military historians. NATO studied how Soviets defeated Germans to plan how Western forces might defeat Soviets. Soviet military academies made the Battle of Moscow central to officer training curriculum. The defensive phase illustrated proper conduct of retreating operations, trading space for time, preserving forces through organized withdrawal, maintaining cohesion despite catastrophic losses. The counteroffensive phase demonstrated Soviet operational art, maskirovka, concealing force concentrations, simultaneous attacks across broad front, exploitation of enemy weaknesses. Soviet military theory, developed through the war and refined afterward, built on Moscow's lessons. The battle became mythology as much as history. The moment when Soviet forces stopped fascist aggression, when the motherland's defenders proved their superiority, when Stalin's leadership demonstrated its brilliance. The mythology obscured massive casualties and near disaster, but the operational lessons were valid regardless. 1990s. Post-Cold War analysis. American military historians, accessing Soviet archives after the USSR's collapse, reassessed the Battle of Moscow with new evidence. The consensus shifted toward emphasizing logistics as the decisive factor, not Soviet operational brilliance or German tactical errors. German forces failed because they outran their supply lines, operated equipment unsuited for Russian winter, and attempted offensive operations beyond their logistical capacity. Soviet forces succeeded because they maintained shorter supply lines, possessed winter-rated equipment, and could replace losses faster than Germans. The technological and tactical balance favored Germany throughout the battle, but the logistical and industrial balance favored the USSR decisively. War is logistics, American analysts concluded. Everything else is details. 21st century. Chinese military academies. People's Liberation Army staff officers studied the Battle of Moscow as an example of people's war defeating technological superiority. The Chinese analysis emphasized mobilization of entire society for war effort, willingness to accept casualties Western nations wouldn't tolerate, industrial relocation under combat conditions, maintenance of fighting will despite catastrophic losses. These lessons aligned with Chinese military doctrine's emphasis on political determination and mass mobilization. The Battle of Moscow demonstrated that technologically superior forces could be defeated by quantitatively superior forces with adequate political will. This interpretation resonated with Chinese strategic culture's emphasis on asymmetric warfare and societal mobilization. The military lessons distilled from Moscow's battle could be categorized systematically. Lesson 1. Logistics. An army's operational reach is determined by logistics, not by tactical capabilities or commander's ambition. German forces reached Moscow's outskirts, but couldn't advance further because supply couldn't reach forward units. This lesson was ancient. Alexander the Great understood it. Napoleon learned it painfully in Russia. But modern mechanized warfare made logistics even more critical. Tanks, trucks, aircraft consumed fuel and ammunition at rates that strained even sophisticated logistics systems. Operating 1,000 kilometers from supply bases made logistics nearly impossible without significant preparation and infrastructure development. Lesson 2: Intelligence and Deception. Soviet operational security was superior to German intelligence gathering capacity. The ghost armies transferred from Siberia arrived completely undetected by German intelligence. Soviet maskirovka concealed force concentrations, deceived Germans about Soviet strength and intentions, enabled the counteroffensive surprise. Modern warfare required intelligence and counterintelligence capabilities matching combat capabilities. Superior tactics couldn't overcome intelligence failure. Germany's inability to detect Soviet reserves proved as decisive as Soviet ability to hide them. Lesson 3: Environmental Preparation. Military operations must account for environmental factors. Equipment must function in deployment environments' actual conditions, not theoretical European conditions. German weapons, vehicles, and clothing were designed for European warfare. They failed catastrophically in Russian winter. Soviet equipment was designed for conditions it would encounter. This advantage, seemingly mundane, proved tactically decisive. Modern militaries learned to test equipment in realistic conditions before deployment, to prepare for worst-case environmental scenarios, to assume Murphy's Law applied to weather as much as combat. Lesson 4: Morale and Motivation. Defending homeland provided morale advantages that propaganda couldn't match. Soviet soldiers fought desperately because they were defending their capital, their families, their country from invaders committed to their extermination. German soldiers fought far from home, for objectives they barely understood, in conditions they'd been told wouldn't exist. The morale differential, impossible to quantify, mattered enormously. Soldiers who believe their cause is just fight harder than soldiers who doubt their mission. Defenders of homeland fight harder than invaders fighting for conquest. This lesson was ancient but remained relevant. Lesson 5: Industrial War Economics. Industrial capacity and production determined war's outcome more than tactical skill or strategic brilliance. Soviet industry, despite losing Western territories, outproduced German industry in key military categories. This quantitative advantage eventually overwhelmed German qualitative advantages. Modern warfare was industrial warfare. The nation that could produce more tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and supplies would eventually prevail over the nation with superior tactics but inferior production. World War II was decided in factories as much as battlefields. Lesson 6: Strategic Depth and Reserves. Deep strategic reserves enabled recovery from catastrophic initial defeats. Soviet ability to draw on Far East divisions, Siberian reserves, mobilized population prevented collapse despite enormous losses. Germany, fully committed from the campaign's beginning, lacked reserves for contingencies. Modern military planning required maintaining strategic reserves even when committed forces faced crisis. The temptation to commit everything to current battle was strong, but lack of reserves for unforeseen contingencies could be catastrophic. The counter lesson, the controversial lesson, centered on Hitler's no-retreat order. Conventional military wisdom argued that Hitler's refusal to permit tactical withdrawals was catastrophic. That professional military judgment would have saved hundreds of thousands of casualties through organized retreats to prepared positions. But some analysts suggested Hitler was correct, that retreat in winter conditions might have become uncontrollable rout. Napoleon's army had disintegrated during winter retreat from Moscow. The Wehrmacht, retreating in similar conditions, might have suffered similar fate. Hitler's insistence on holding positions, however costly, may have prevented complete collapse. This interpretation remained controversial among military historians, but represented legitimate debate about whether Hitler's intuition was disastrous megalomania or correct assessment of unique circumstances. The fundamental question underlying all lessons was whether Nazi Germany's military learned anything useful from Moscow. The evidence suggested not. Hitler's no-retreat order became standard policy, applied at Stalingrad with catastrophic results. German logistics never adapted to Eastern Front distances and conditions. Intelligence never developed capacity to penetrate Soviet operational security. Equipment continued to be designed for European warfare rather than Russian conditions. The Wehrmacht continued operations that outran supply lines, repeated mistakes that had failed at Moscow, ignored lessons written in blood and snow outside the Soviet capital. This pattern suggested that Germany's defeat was overdetermined, not just one fatal error, but systematic inability to learn from failures, adapt to circumstances, or acknowledge reality conflicting with ideological preconceptions. Modern militaries, studying the Battle of Moscow decades later, extracted lessons their institutions could absorb. Logistics matters, intelligence matters, environmental preparation matters, industrial capacity matters. These lessons shaped military planning, equipment procurement, strategic thinking. But the deeper lesson, that war is politics, that political objectives must align with military capabilities, that refusing to acknowledge reality doesn't change reality, was harder to institutionalize. The Wehrmacht was history's most tactically proficient army, led by operationally brilliant commanders, employing innovative tactics, demonstrating courage and skill unsurpassed in warfare. Yet it lost because its strategic objectives were unachievable. Its logistics were inadequate, its intelligence failed systematically, and its leadership refused to acknowledge reality. The lessons written in snow outside Moscow taught that tactical excellence without strategic wisdom leads to defeat, that courage without logistics support leads to catastrophe, that refusing to retreat when retreat is necessary leads to annihilation. These lessons were available to anyone willing to learn them. Whether modern militaries would prove better students than Nazi Germany remained uncertain. The snow outside Moscow had written its lessons clearly. The question was whether anyone was reading. December 5th, 2021, Moscow, Russia. Veterans gathered at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier for the 80th anniversary of the Moscow counteroffensive. There were only a handful of veterans left now, men and women in their late 90s or older, survivors of a battle that had consumed nearly 2 million casualties. They wore their medals, dozens of decorations covering their chests, tangible evidence of service the younger generation could barely comprehend. Russian television cameras documented the ceremony. Government officials gave speeches about courage, sacrifice, patriotic duty. The veterans listened with expressions that mixed pride and something darker, memory of what the battle actually cost. They'd survived when millions died. That survival was simultaneously achievement and burden, honor and guilt. They would be the last generation to remember the battle from personal experience. Soon, memory would yield entirely to history. The Panfilov Guardsman Monument stood 65 kilometers from Moscow on the Volokolamsk Highway, marking where 28 soldiers allegedly stopped German tanks in November 1941. The story was almost certainly mythical, Soviet-era propaganda, constructed from fragments of actual battles and shaped for political purposes. Historians had documented the mythology's creation, proved that the specific incident as described never occurred. Yet the monument remained, visited by thousands annually, because the myth represented real heroism that occurred across hundreds of similar battles. 28 specific men might not have stopped German tanks at that exact location, but hundreds of small units performed equally courageous actions. The myth honored reality even while misrepresenting details. Memory served purposes history couldn't fulfill. German cemetery outside Moscow contained rows of crosses marking German dead, maintained by reconciliation organizations. The cemetery's existence represented diplomatic achievement, Russian and German governments cooperating to honor fallen soldiers, acknowledging shared humanity despite war's hatreds. Young Germans visited the cemetery, descendants of Wehrmacht soldiers, seeking connection to grandfathers who died far from home. The visits were complicated emotionally, honoring grandfather's memory while acknowledging the regime he fought for committed atrocities. Russian visitors sometimes came to the German cemetery too, mostly elderly people who remembered the war, paying respects to enemy dead. The gestures represented forgiveness's possibility, healing decades after wounds were inflicted, though full reconciliation remained elusive given historical grievances on both sides. Moscow's Central Museum of the Great Patriotic War preserved over 50,000 artifacts from the battle: weapons, uniforms, documents, personal effects, photographs. The museum's permanent exhibition traced the war's narrative from invasion through victory, with the Battle of Moscow occupying central position. Dioramas depicted key moments: Soviet soldiers counterattacking through winter storms, German prisoners marching through Moscow streets after surrender, civilians defending their city. The narrative was distinctly Russian, emphasizing Soviet heroism while minimizing Stalin's errors and Red Army's catastrophic early defeats. Western historians criticized the museum's selective history, but Russian visitors appreciated the patriotic narrative. Memory served national identity, not necessarily objective historical truth. Post-Soviet memory was complicated by acknowledgement of Stalin-era repressions that Soviet historiography had suppressed. Veterans who'd survived the war often faced imprisonment in Gulag labor camps afterward. Survivors of German captivity were automatically suspected of collaboration. Officers who'd retreated were accused of treason. Anyone who'd seen Western countries during the war was considered politically unreliable. These repressions, carefully hidden during Soviet era, became public knowledge after the USSR's collapse. Modern Russian memory had to balance honoring veteran sacrifice while acknowledging the regime's brutality toward those same veterans. The contradiction was painful. Soldiers saved the Soviet Union from Nazi conquest, then suffered under the system they'd saved. Memory couldn't resolve this tension, but had to acknowledge it. German memory of the Battle of Moscow was more subdued, incorporated into broader narrative of German defeat and national reckoning with Nazi crimes. German museums and memorials acknowledged Wehrmacht participation in war crimes, rejected post-war mythology of clean Wehrmacht, fighting honorably while SS committed atrocities. German military defeat at Moscow was remembered as catastrophe, marking the beginning of Germany's inevitable defeat. Preliminary disaster before Stalingrad's larger catastrophe. German national memory focused less on specific battles than on the war's meaning. Aggressive war based on racial ideology led to national destruction, military defeat, division, decades of occupation. The lesson was never again. Never again permit ideology to override reality. Never again allow militarism to dominate politics. Never again wage aggressive war. This lesson, learned through catastrophic defeat, shaped German political culture for 3 generations. Memorial statistics illustrated the battle's scale. Over 1,400 identified mass graves in Moscow region, containing both Soviet and German dead. The graves were scattered across hundreds of kilometers, marking defensive positions, battle sites, field hospitals, anywhere soldiers fell and couldn't be evacuated. Many graves were identified only decades after the war through archival research and local memory. Others remained unmarked, their exact locations lost. The ongoing recovery of remains continued 80 years after the battle. Construction projects occasionally uncovered mass graves. Forensic teams attempted to identify remains. Families sometimes learned fates of ancestors missing since 1941. Death had bureaucratic permanence. Casualty reports, burial records, identification tags, personal effects. But death also had physical permanence: bodies in frozen ground, remains that resisted decomposition, material evidence that outlasted memory. The ongoing recovery work by volunteer organizations showed memory's evolution. Groups of mostly young Russians dedicated vacation time to searching battlefields with metal detectors, recovering remains of soldiers killed 80 years earlier. They identified remains when possible, coordinated proper burial, notified families. The work was grim. Human bones, rust-frozen equipment, personal effects preserved by cold. Volunteers explained their motivation varied: honoring sacrifice, understanding history, processing complex feelings about Russian identity and Soviet legacy. The physical act of recovering remains created connection to history that museums and monuments couldn't match. Touching a soldier's identification tag, holding a soldier's personal effects, Excavating a soldier's remains made the battle real in ways historical accounts never could. The moral complexity question, how to remember a battle involving such catastrophic casualties and moral ambiguity, had no satisfactory answer. Soviet soldiers defended their homeland against Nazi invasion, an unambiguously just cause. But they fought for Stalin's regime, which had murdered millions through purges, collectivization, induced famine, and political repression. German soldiers demonstrated courage and professionalism, but served a regime committed to genocide and racial extermination. How to honor soldiers' sacrifice while acknowledging the systems they served. How to remember battles fought bravely on both sides when one side fought for objectively evil regime. These questions troubled historians, museum curators, memorial organizations, and anyone attempting to transform battle into memory. The final question, what we owe the dead, was simultaneously simple and impossible. Truth, memory, or myth? Truth meant acknowledging complexity. Soviet mistakes, German motivations, civilian suffering, casualty statistics horror, victories cost, heroism's rarity amid mostly ordinary soldiers trying to survive. Memory meant preserving veterans' testimonies, maintaining monuments, marking graves, ensuring the battle wasn't forgotten. Myth meant narratives serving national identity, stories of heroic resistance or tragic sacrifice, simplified accounts accessible to populations who'd never experienced war's reality. These three approaches, truth, memory, myth, existed in tension. Truth undermined comforting narratives. Memory faded as veterans died. Myth distorted reality. Yet all three were necessary. Without truth, memory became propaganda. Without memory, truth became abstract. Without myth, neither truth nor memory engaged public consciousness. The Battle of Moscow's memory continued evolving 8 decades after the battle ended. In Russia, the battle remained central to national identity, evidence that Russian people could survive catastrophic invasion through determination and sacrifice. In Germany, the battle was preliminary disaster before larger catastrophes, part of reckoning with aggressive war's consequences. In Western countries, the battle was often overshadowed by more familiar narratives: Stalingrad, D-Day, Hiroshima. Despite Moscow's arguably greater strategic significance, the divergent memories reflected different national experiences. Russians remembered saving their capital and turning the war's tide. Germans remembered the beginning of catastrophic defeat. Westerners remembered the Soviet Union's unexpected resilience. The physical landscape still bore traces of the battle. Rusted equipment occasionally surfaced in forests. Defensive positions remained visible in some areas. Monuments marked important sites. But the soldiers who'd fought were nearly all dead, their direct memories lost. The battle was transitioning from living memory to history, from personal experience to archival record, from veterans' stories to historians' analyses. Future generations would know the Battle of Moscow only through documents, photographs, artifacts, and scholarly accounts, mediated memory rather than direct testimony. This transition was inevitable, natural, and troubling. Something irreplaceable was being lost, the human reality of the battle as experienced by soldiers who fought it, civilians who survived it, the generation that lived through it. Statistics survived, casualty figures, production numbers, distances, temperatures, but statistics couldn't capture what it meant to freeze in a foxhole at -40 degrees Celsius, to watch comrades die, to advance knowing you'd probably be killed, to defend your city knowing its fall meant your family's death. The memory of snow and fire, the battle's defining imagery, would persist even as personal memories faded. Snow representing the winter that destroyed the Wehrmacht's offensive capacity. Fire representing the artillery, the Katyusha rockets, the burning vehicles, the intensity of combat that consumed nearly 2 million casualties in months. The Battle of Moscow was ending its transition from event to memory, from memory to history, from history to symbol. What remained was simultaneously too much and too little, too many dead to remember individually, too much suffering to comprehend fully, too many lessons to absorb completely, yet too little direct memory preserved, too little recognition of the battle's significance. too little understanding of what was lost and what was saved. The battle would be remembered, that was certain. How it would be remembered, what lessons future generations would draw, what meaning they would find, whether they would honor the dead adequately, remained uncertain. The snow and fire had consumed nearly 2 million lives defending and attacking a single city. What remained was obligation, to remember truthfully, to honor sacrifice authentically, to learn lessons written in blood and snow, to ensure such catastrophic conflicts weren't repeated. Whether future generations would fulfill that obligation was their choice. The dead at Moscow had fulfilled their obligation. They'd fought, suffered, and died for causes they believed just or simply because war gave them no choice. Memory was what the living owed the dead. History's judgment on whether that debt was paid adequately would take generations yet to come.